Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The Wind Began It. A low susurrus through the drying corn that surrounded the town of Ember Hollow. It was not a violent wind, but a whispering one, slipping through the cracks of window frames and under doors, carrying the scent of cold earth and rotting pumpkins. It moved the leaves in restless circles on the lawns, 1,000 brittle hands scratching at the coming dark. To the children, it was the breath of the season, exciting and festive. To others, older and more attuned to silences, it felt like a message, a single, sustained note of warning breathed from some great, unseen mouth. It was October 28th, and the countdown had begun. 3 days until Halloween. The town of Ember Hollow existed for autumn. Its economy was a fragile ecosystem built on pumpkin patches, cider mills, and a legendary haunted hayride that drew visitors from 3 states. The old pioneer settlement, now a sanitized tourist attraction on the edge of town, was the source of its modest fame and its original, darker name, Starvation Hollow. The wind seemed to gather there, in the skeletal remains of the covered wagons and the replica of the old grist mill, before spilling out into the modern streets, tainted with the dust of old sorrows. Arthur Browks heard the wind. He stood on his porch, a man in his late 60s, with the landscape of his years carved deep into his face. His family had founded Ember Hollow. He knew its stories, the ones they told the tourists, and the ones they only whispered after a few drinks. He watched the oak tree in his front yard, its branches like twisted, blackened bones, against a sky the color of a day-old bruise. The jack-o'-lanterns on every step, carved by his own trembling hand, seemed to watch him back. Their grins, lit from within by flickering electric candles, were not joyful. They were the rictus grins of skulls. The wind moaned through a gap in the porch rail, and for a moment it shaped a word. Soon, across town, Lily Mercer was carving a pumpkin with her son, Sam. The kitchen was warm and smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg from the pie cooling on the stovetop. Sam, 7 years old with eyes the color of the October sky, was elbow-deep in pumpkin guts, pulling out the slimy, seed-clumped innards with gleeful disgust. What should his face be, Mommy? Scary or funny? Lily smiled, a tired but genuine expression. Whatever you want him to be. He is your pumpkin. She looked at the orange globe, its top neatly cut. It was a ritual, this annual evisceration. You reach inside, you pull out the wet, stringy heart, you carve a new identity for it. A face of light to ward off the dark. But her knife, poised in her hand, felt heavy. The act felt suddenly ancient, less like a craft project and more like a preparation. The waxy, vegetal smell of the pumpkin-esque flesh was thick in her nostrils, and for a dizzying second, it smelled not of life, but of decay. Sam held up a handful of glistening pulp. It feels like brains. The wind rattled the kitchen window. A sharp, impatient tap. The dread accumulated like frost on a pane of glass, slow and crystalline. On October 29th, the town awoke to a killing frost. It silvered every lawn and etched delicate, fern-like patterns on the windows, patterns that, if you stared too long, looked like tiny, screaming faces. The pumpkins on the porches seemed to have aged overnight, their vibrant orange skin dulling, soft spots of brown and black blooming like contagion. The corn in the great maze at Henderson S. Farm, already tall and desiccated, rustled with a sound like a crowd of people murmuring secrets just out of sight. Arthur drove to the Historical Society, his old pickup truck crunching through the frozen leaves. He ignored the replica wagons and went to the back, to the small, neglected cemetery. The headstones were worn smooth, the names of the original settlers lost to wind and rain. All but one. A single, rough-hewn slab of granite stood apart, its inscription still legible: Damien Crow. Leader. Lost. The story was that Crow S. wagon party, stranded here by an early snow in 1849, had resorted to unspeakable things to survive. That Damien Crow had made a choice, a bargain with the hunger that gnawed at their bellies, and the cold that stole the breath from their children. The official story was one of tragic pioneer hardship. The whispered story was something else, something that involved a hollow in the woods and a harvest that was not of corn. That night, the power went out. Not all over town, just in a few scattered blocks. A random pattern of darkness under the swollen, orange gaze of the harvest moon. In the sudden silence, the wind was louder. Lily-lit candles, their flames throwing monstrous, dancing shadows onto the walls. Sam, frightened, pointed to the window. "Mommy, the scarecrow is looking at me." Lily looked out. The scarecrow from the Henderson S. cornfield stood at the edge of their property. A cross of wood draped in old flannel and denim, its head a burlap sack stuffed with straw. It had always been there, but now, in the erratic candlelight, its painted-on smile seemed to have stretched into something knowing and cruel. Its posture was different, no longer slumped and passive, but alert, its empty gaze fixed on their house. It was just a trick of the light, of course. The wind must have shifted it. She pulled the curtains closed, her skin prickling with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. October 30th, the day the laughter started to sound wrong. Children were everywhere, hyped on sugar and anticipation, their costumes rustling as they ran through piles of leaves. A little witch, a superhero, a ghost. Their laughter should have been a joyful sound, but to Arthur, sitting on his porch, it had a sharp, jagged edge. It was the sound of mockery. He watched a group of them surround a particularly rotten pumpkin on the Nielsen's porch, its caved-in face swarming with flies. They poked it with sticks, shrieking with a delight that was too fervent, too savage. Lily took Sam to the School S Halloween Carnival. The gymnasium was a riot of noise and color, but the air was thick with the smell of popcorn and fake fog, and beneath it, the faint, coppery tang of fear. They played a game where you had to bob for apples in a metal tub of icy water. Sam plunged his face in, his small body tense with effort. When he pulled back, gasping and empty-mouthed, Lily glanced into the disturbed water. The reflection of the string lights overhead shimmered, and for a heartbeat, it was not her son's face she saw reflected, but another face, gaunt and hollow-cheeked, with eyes as dark and deep as old wells. She jerked back, her heart hammering against her ribs. The image was gone. Just a trick of the light, the water, her tired mind. The climax began not with a bang, but with a chime. The doorbell. It was 5:30 p.m. on October 31st. True darkness had fallen, and the veil, as the old story said, was at its thinnest. The streets of Ember Hollow were alive with phantoms and goblins, their plastic jack-o'-lantern buckets swinging as they moved from house to house in packs. Porch lights glowed like a chain of warding fires against the immense dark. Lily answered the door, a large bowl of candy in her hands. A group of trick-or-treaters stood there, silent. They were taller than the others, their costumes elaborate and strangely old-fashioned. One wore a moth-eaten suit with a top hat, his face obscured by a smooth porcelain mask. Another was draped in what looked like real dirt-caked burlap, a sack over its head with stitched-shut eyes. A third wore a dress of faded black lace, her face powdered deathly white. They didn't say trick or treat. They just stood there, utterly still, their presence a pressure on the doorstep. "Well, aren't you scary?" Lily said, her voice unnaturally bright. She scooped a handful of candy into their proffered bags, her fingers brushing against one. The hand felt cold and hard, like wood or stone. She snatched her hand back. The one in the top hat tilted its head. The painted smile on the porcelain mask seemed to deepen. Then, as one, they turned and melted back into the swirling fog that had begun to creep through the streets. Sam was hiding behind her legs. "I didn't like them, Mommy. It's just a costume, honey," she whispered. But the words felt like a lie. She closed the door, locking it, and peered through the peephole. The fog was thick now, a living entity that swallowed the light from the jack-o'-lanterns, turning their grins into smears of dying orange in a gray void. She could hear the distant sounds of celebration, but they were muffled, distorted, as if coming from another world. Arthur Prowks did not answer his door. He sat in his dark living room, a single candle burning on the mantelpiece. He held an old journal, its pages brittle and brown. It was the diary of his great-great-grandfather, who had been a boy in Damien Crow's party. The final entry, scrawled in a shaking hand, was burned into his memory. "The hollow has taken him. Damien says the hunger must be fed, that the land requires an offering. He says it is the only way any of us will see the spring. He went into the woods with little Thomas. He came back alone. His eyes are different. He says the mask must stay on after the harvest moon. The others are afraid. I am afraid. The wind does not sound like wind anymore. It sounds like it is calling his name." The doorbell rang, a long, insistent chime that echoed in the silent house. Arthur did not move. It rang again and again, a frantic, discordant rhythm. He heard the front door rattle in its frame, not a knock, but a slow, deliberate scraping, like a branch or a bone. He saw a shadow pass in front of the window, tall and thin, crowned with something that might have been a hat or antlers. The scratching moved along the side of the house, towards the back door. Arthur closed his eyes. He knew who it was. It was the leader, burdened with his impossible choice. It was the malevolent presence, feeding on their downfall. It was the bargain, come due once more. The town had sown its fields with candy and laughter, but it was time to reap what had been sown long, long ago. Lily put Sam to bed, his Spider-Man costume folded neatly on a chair. He was asleep almost instantly, exhausted by the night's excitement. She went downstairs, trying to shake off a deep, unnameable anxiety. The house was too quiet. The festive lights from outside were gone, swallowed by the fog. She walked to the back window and looked out into the yard. The fog was a solid wall of gray, but it had parted just for a moment around the old apple tree. The scarecrow was there. It was no longer at the edge of the property. It stood directly beneath the tree, its arms no longer pinned to the crossbeam. They hung at its sides, and its head, the burlap sack, was no longer facing the house. It was tilted upwards towards Sam's window. The painted smile was gone. In its place, the burlap was torn into a wide, dark O. A silent scream frozen in rough cloth. Lily stumbled back, a hand flying to her mouth to stifle her own cry. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers numb with terror. No signal. The landline was dead, emitting only a hollow, hissing static that sounded like the wind through dead corn. She ran to the front door, checking the lock again, then to every window, pulling the curtains shut. She was an animal in a cage, sensing the predator just outside. She finally crept into the living room and sat on the sofa in the dark, her ears straining for any sound over the frantic beating of her heart. Hours passed. The town outside had fallen completely silent. The fog pressed against the windows, a damp, sound-absorbing shroud. Then she heard it, a soft, wet crunch, then another. The sound of someone or something taking slow, deliberate steps through the fallen leaves in her front yard. It stopped directly in front of her house. Lily stopped breathing. She could feel a presence on the other side of the door, a coldness that seeped through the wood and the lock. There was a faint, sniffing sound, like a predator scenting the air. Then, a single, soft scrape against the door. It was not a demand, but a confirmation. The sound moved away. The crunching footsteps receded slowly down the walkway and faded into the silence. Lily did not move for a long time. The terror was a physical weight on her chest. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to dilute the absolute blackness of the night, she found the courage to move. She crept to the front door, her body stiff and cold, and unlocked it with trembling hands. She pulled it open, just a crack. The world was white, shrouded in a dissipating fog. The street was littered with the detritus of the holiday: candy wrappers, a lost pirate hat, a broken mask. jack-o'-lanterns on every porch had been extinguished, their carved faces now just dark, empty sockets. And on her own welcome mat, lying neatly in the center, was a single perfect apple. It was a deep, lustrous red, unnaturally shiny, as if it had been polished. It was unblemished, without a single bruise or mark from the frost. It looked like the most delicious apple she had ever seen. She knelt and picked it up. It was cold, so cold it burned her skin. And as she held it, the fog lifted completely, revealing the lawn. The scarecrow was back in its place at the edge of the property, its arms once again fixed to the crossbeam, its burlap head facing the field. The torn, screaming mouth was gone. The painted, jovial smile was back in place. But the scarecrow was not alone. All along the street, in every front yard, stood identical scarecrows. Dozens of them. They had not been there the day before. They stood sentinel, their stuffed forms identical in their flannel and denim, their burlap heads all turned at the exact same slight angle, not towards the cornfields, but towards the houses. Their identical, painted smiles were wide and knowing, a silent army left behind after the night's passing. They were a reaping. They were a warning. They were a promise. Lily looked down at the apple in her hand, its perfect red skin gleaming in the weak morning sun. She did not know what it meant. She did not know if it was a gift, a threat, or a communion. She only knew that Halloween was over, but the hollow feeling in the town of Ember Hollow had not gone away. It had just put on a new face, and it was waiting patiently for the wind to rise again. She closed the door, the apple still clutched in her hand. Its coldness was seeping into her palm, a deep, penetrating chill that felt unnatural. She wanted to throw it away, to hurl it into the trash and forget she ever saw it. But a strange paralysis held her. It felt important. It felt like a message meant specifically for her. Upstairs, Sam called out, his voice thick with sleep. "Mommy." Lily shoved the apple into the pocket of her robe, the weight of it pulling the fabric down. "I am here, sweetie," she called back, forcing her voice to be light. She climbed the stairs, her legs heavy. Sam was sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes. "I had a weird dream," he said. The scarecrows were dancing in the yard. They were singing a song without any words. Lily's blood ran colder than the apple in her pocket. She smoothed his hair. "It was just a dream, honey, from all the candy." She helped him get dressed, her movements automatic. Through his bedroom window, she could see them, the rows of silent, smiling sentinels. A man from across the street, Mr. Henderson, was standing on his lawn in a bathrobe, staring at the scarecrow that now stood mere feet from his front door. He reached out a tentative hand and poked its chest, then jerked back as if shocked. Down in the kitchen, Lily tried to make breakfast, but the routine was shattered. The world outside the window was wrong. She finally took the apple from her pocket and set it on the counter. It seemed to absorb the morning light, glowing with a sinister vitality. Sam saw it. "Ooh, a shiny apple. Can I have it?" "No," she said, too sharply. She softened her tone. "No, honey, it's dirty from outside. I'll get you a banana. The phone rang, a jarringly normal sound. She snatched it up. The line was no longer dead, but the voice on the other end was frantic. It was Sarah from 2 streets over. Lily, are you seeing this? These things, they ray everywhere. And my prize-winning pumpkins, Lily, they ray all rotted. They caved in, like they been hollowed out. Lily looked at her own counter, where the pie from 2 nights ago sat. A patch of blue-green mold was spreading across its surface with visible speed. The bananas in the fruit bowl were already black and mushy, but the apple on the counter remained pristine, a blasphemy of perfection in the midst of decay. She got Sam to school, driving through streets that felt like a dreamscape. Parents stood in small, nervous clusters, talking in low voices, their eyes darting towards the scarecrows that now populated their lawns. The school itself was abuzz with a tense energy. The teachers' smiles were strained. The air in the building still carried the faint, sweet smell of decay. On her way home, she saw Arthur Pralk's pickup truck parked haphazardly outside the Historical Society. The old man was standing by the Crow family gravestone, his head bowed. He looked up as she drove past, and their eyes met for a split second. In his gaze, she saw no surprise, no confusion, only a profound and weary resignation. He knew. He had always known. Back inside her own home, the silence was oppressive. She stood in the living room, staring at the apple. It was a connection, a thread leading back to whatever had visited her door last night. She thought of the story Sam had told her about the school carnival, about bobbing for apples. She thought of the old tales, the ones she'd always dismissed, about offerings and harvests that were not of corn. A sudden, clear knowledge settled over her. This was not over. The passing of the Halloween night was not an end, but an intermission. The scarecrows were not a conclusion, they were a marker. They were a sign that the land, Starvation Hollow, had accepted the town's modern, unconscious offering of fear and revelry. But a traditional harvest required a final, specific yield. She picked up the apple. It was so cold it was almost warm now, a paradox that made her skin crawl. She knew, with a certainty that came from a place deeper than reason, that it was not for Sam. It was not for any of the children. The hollowed-out pumpkins, the accelerated decay, the scarecrows facing the homes, it was all a preparation. The land was hungry again, and it was demanding its tithe. The apple was an invitation to understand, a first taste of the truth. Lily Mercer, a relative newcomer who had never believed in the old stories, was now holding the core of Ember Hollow's oldest, darkest secret in her hand. And she knew, looking at its flawless, crimson skin, that the countdown had not ended at all. It had simply started again, with a new and more terrifying clock. She didn't eat the apple. She placed it in the center of her kitchen table, a dark red jewel on the worn wood. It became the focal point of the house, an object she found herself circling, her eyes drawn to it, no matter where she stood. The day wore on with a strange, muffled quality. News reports on the local station were brief and bewildered. mentioning unexplained power outages and vandalism involving Halloween decorations, but offered no real explanation. No one in authority seemed to see the pattern, or they were willfully ignoring it. By mid-afternoon, a thick quiet had settled over the neighborhood, broken only by the occasional sound of a car door slamming as someone left and did not return. Lily saw the Millers packing their SUV with suitcases, their faces pale and tight. They didn't look at the scarecrow in their yard as they sped away. She wondered if they would be back. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, earlier than it should have, Lily made a decision. She could not sit in her house with that apple any longer. She wrapped it in a cloth napkin, its coldness leaching through the fabric, and put it in her purse. She would go to the one person she was sure had answers. Arthur Prelks answered his door on the first knock, as if he had been waiting for her. His small house was a dim cave of books and shadows, smelling of old paper and dust. He didn't speak, simply looked at her with those tired, knowing eyes and gestured for her to come in. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She opened her purse, took out the napkin-wrapped bundle, and placed it on his cluttered coffee table. She unfolded the cloth, revealing the apple. Arthur stared at it for a long time. He did not seem surprised. He slowly lowered himself into an armchair, the springs groaning in protest. "So it came to your door," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "It left you a gift." "What is it?" Lily asked, her own voice trembling. "What does it want?" "It's a reminder," Arthur said, "a receipt. The harvest was good this year. The fear was rich. The children's laughter. It fed the soil. But a full harvest requires a final sheaf, a sacrifice to carry the community through the winter, to ensure the land's favor." He pointed a gnarled finger at the apple. "That is the seed of next year's crop, and it is also the test." Lily shook her head, confusion and fear warring within her. A test for what? To see who understands, to see who is chosen. In the old days, it was simple. A family was chosen, a child was given, taken to the hollow. But time moves on. The old ways get forgotten, twisted. The hunger remains, but the method changes. He looked toward his window, at the scarecrow standing vigil in his yard. It adapts. It uses our own symbols against us. Our scarecrows, our jack-o'-lanterns, our treats. It's been gathering strength for decades, feeding on little fears, waiting for the veil to thin enough for it to reach through properly again. A cold horror dawned on Lily. The children. Is it going to take a child? Arthur's gaze was unbearably sad. It might, or it might take something else. A piece of the town's soul, its future, its hope. It will take whatever we are most afraid to lose. He looked directly at her. "It left the apple for you, Lily. You are part of the story now. You have a choice. You can take that apple to the hollow, to the place where the old crow farm stood. You can offer it back, or you can keep it. If you keep it, the hunger will fester. It will grow in your house, in your life. It will twist everything. Sam." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The image of the scarecrow looking up at Sam's window was burned into her mind. This was not a random haunting. It was a selection. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't go out there." "You can," Arthur said, "and you must, because if you don't, it will come inside. The lock on your door won't matter. The light won't matter. It is in the soil and the air now. It is in the apple." He leaned forward, his old eyes fierce. "The story doesn't end until someone finishes it. My family has been carrying this for generations. We were too afraid. We hid the journals. We told ourselves it was just stories. And look what it has become." Lily looked down at the apple. It seemed to pulse with a faint, dark light. She understood then that it was not just an object. It was a conduit, a point of contact between her world and the ravenous silence of Starvation Hollow. To keep it was to invite that silence into her home forever. To return, it was to walk directly into its heart. She rewrapped the apple, the decision settling on her shoulders like a physical weight. She had no choice. She was a mother. The threat was no longer a whisper in the wind. It was a polished red apple on her kitchen table, and it had her son's name on it. "I'll need directions," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Arthur nodded slowly, a look of grim approval on his face. He began to draw a map on a scrap of yellowed paper, his hand shaking only slightly. He was sending her into the dark, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur Prowkes looked like a man who had finally passed on a burden he could no longer carry alone. The story was hers now. Arthur S. directions were a series of shaky lines leading to a blank spot on the map, a place where the roads ended and the old woods began. He pressed the paper into her hand. His fingers were ice cold. "Go before full dark," he said, "and do not stop for anyone. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, the path will try to turn you around. It does not want to be found." Lily drove, the apple resting on the passenger seat beside her, a malevolent companion. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon, and the scarecrows in every yard seemed to watch her car pass, their painted smiles seeming to widen in the fading light. She left the paved roads behind, then the gravel, until she was navigating a pair of deep, muddy ruts that cut through a tunnel of skeletal trees. The forest here was unnaturally still. No birds called. No squirrels chattered. The only sound was the crunch of her tires over brittle twigs and the frantic thumping of her own heart. The ruts ended abruptly at a rusted, collapsed barbed wire fence. This was it, the Crow land. She killed the engine, and the silence rushed in, thick and heavy. She got out, clutching the wrapped apple in one hand and a heavy flashlight in the other. The beam cut a frail swath through the gathering dark, illuminating gnarled trunks and thickets of thorn. The path, what little there was of it, was a faint indentation in the leaf litter. She walked, her breath pluming in the chill air. The trees seemed to press closer with every step, their branches like bony fingers reaching for her. She heard a rustle to her left and swung the flashlight. Nothing was there. Then a whisper from her right, a sibilant hiss that might have been the wind, but the air was dead still. something moved in the periphery of her vision, a flicker of pale cloth and a painted smile. She froze, the beam of her light darting wildly. Between the trees, standing perfectly still, was one of the scarecrows. It was here, in the deep woods, miles from town. Its head was tilted, its burlap gaze fixed on her. She took another step, and another, her pace quickening. She saw another one, partially hidden behind a thick oak. Then a third. They were all around her. A silent, smiling audience to her journey. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single, faint word that seemed to come from the very earth beneath her feet. Stay. Lily broke into a run. The undergrowth clawed at her legs. The flashlight beam bounced and jittered, creating monstrous, leaping shadows. The path dipped down into a low, bowl-shaped hollow. The air grew colder, so cold it hurt to breathe. In the center of the hollow stood a single, ancient oak tree, its branches twisted and bare. And at its base, a ring of blackened, fire-scarred stones. This was the place. Her legs felt like water. She forced herself to walk to the center of the stone ring. The ground was bare, not a single leaf or blade of grass growing there. The silence was absolute now, a pressure on her eardrums. This was where it had happened. The failed harvests, the desperate choices, the old, unforgotten hunger. She unwrapped the apple. It glowed in the dim light, its red skin almost black in the twilight. She held it in her open palm, her arm trembling. "I am here," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "I am giving it back." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint sound started from the base of the great oak. A soft, wet, tearing sound. The earth itself seemed to be splitting open. A dark, viscous liquid bubbled up from the roots, pooling in the ring of stones. It wasn't water. It was thick and black, and it smelled of turned soil and spoiled fruit. From the center of the black pool, a long, thin shape began to rise. It was a hand, sculpted from mud and root and corn husk. It was followed by an arm, and then a shoulder as something pulled itself slowly, laboriously, from the heart of the hollow. A head emerged, crowned with a tangle of thorny branches that looked like antlers. It had no face, only a smooth, dark surface that reflected no light. It was the thing from the stories, the leader, the bargainer, the hollow S heart. It stood before her, dripping and silent, towering over her. It was the source of the scarecrows, the source of the fear. It was the embodiment of the town S original sin. Lily stood her ground, her hand still outstretched, the apple offered like a pagan communion. The thing leaned forward, its faceless head hovering inches from her palm. She felt an impossible coldness radiate from it, a chill that went straight to her soul. It did not take the apple. Instead, it placed its own muddy, root-twined hand over hers, closing her fingers around the fruit. The touch was like death itself. A jolt of pure, ancient malice shot up her arm. In that instant, she didn't see the hollow. She saw her own living room. She saw Sam, asleep on the sofa, and she saw the scarecrow from their yard standing over him. Its burlap head now turned, its painted smile gone, replaced by that same dark, screaming "Oh!" Its stuffed hand was reaching down, about to touch his cheek. A choice. The bargain was being remade, not for the town, but for her. A scream tore from Lily S.'s throat, not of fear, but of defiance. No. She wrenched her hand back, breaking the contact. The vision vanished. The thing in the hollow recoiled, a low, grinding rumble emanating from its core, a sound of rocks breaking deep underground. It was a sound of fury. Lily didn't think. She turned and ran, scrambling up the slope of the hollow, the apple still clutched in her hand. She didn't look back. She heard the thing behind her, a sound of tearing roots and shifting earth, but she didn't stop. She crashed through the woods, the flashlight long since dropped and lost. The scarecrows watched her flight, their smiles now seeming like grimaces of rage. She found her car, fumbled with the keys, and spun it around in a shower of mud and leaves. She didn't stop driving until she was back on paved road, her headlights illuminating the familiar, terrifying sight of the scarecrows standing guard in Ember Hollow. She had not given back the apple. She had rejected the bargain. She pulled into her own driveway, her body shaking uncontrollably. The house was dark. She burst through the front door, calling Sam's name. He was in the living room, right where she had seen him in the vision, safe, watching cartoons. He looked up, startled. "Mom, what's wrong?" She rushed to him, pulling him into a tight hug, feeling the solid, warm reality of him. She had the apple. The connection was still open. The thing in the hollow was angry. It had shown her its price, and she had refused to pay. The story was not finished. It had simply become hers, and Sam's alone. The long, patient wait was over. The hunt was beginning. The cartoon characters danced and bickered on the screen, their cheerful noise a stark, fragile barrier against the silence that had followed Lily inside. She held Sam too tightly until he squirmed. "You're squishing me, Mom." She loosened her grip, but didn't let go, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. The scarecrow was still out there, in their yard. She could feel its attention like a physical weight against the house. The apple was in her coat pocket, a cold, hard lump against her ribs. She had brought the heart of the hollow back with her. "Let's get you ready for bed," she said, her voice too bright, too thin. She rushed through the routine, her ears straining for any sound from outside. She checked the locks on the doors and windows twice, then a third time. She left every light in the living room and hallway burning. When she finally tucked Sam into bed, his small face looked pale in the lamplight. "Mom, are the scarecrows going to go away now?" he asked. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "I'm working on it, honey. Just try to get some sleep." She sat on the edge of his bed until his breathing evened out into the soft rhythms of sleep. Only then did she allow herself to tremble. She went to the window and peered through the blinds. The scarecrow stood in its same spot, but its posture seemed different. No longer a passive sentinel, it now looked poised, its straw-stuffed body angled toward the house, its blank face aimed directly at his window. Waiting, she went to the kitchen and took the apple from her pocket. She placed it on the counter. It seemed darker now, a deep Venus red. The perfect skin felt like a lie, a thin membrane holding back a core of pure rot. Arthur had said it was a seed. A seed for what? A soft tap at the back door made her jump. It wasn't a knock. It was a gentle, almost polite, scraping sound. Tap, scrape, tap. Her blood ran cold. She knew what it was. She had seen the hands, made of mud and root. She picked up the heaviest knife from the block, her grip slippery with sweat. She crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The back porch was empty. Then a shape dropped from above, swinging into view to fill the small circle of glass. It was the scarecrow, hanging upside down from the porch roof, its burlap head inverted, the painted smile now a furious frown. Its head twitched, a jerky, insect-like movement, and it tapped its stuffed hand against the door once more. Tap, scrape, tap. Lily stumbled back, a scream caught in her throat. She looked frantically around the kitchen. The knife felt useless, a toy against the thing outside. Her eyes fell on the apple. It was the connection. It was how it was finding its way in, focusing its attention. She grabbed a dish towel, wrapped the apple, and yanked open a lower cabinet. She shoved it into the very back, behind the pots and pans, and slammed the door shut. As she did, the tapping at the back door stopped. She waited, heart hammering, for a full minute. Silence. Cautiously, she returned to the peephole. The porch was empty. She dared to look out the window over the sink. The scarecrow was back in the center of the yard, standing motionless once more, its back to the house. It was as if the last few minutes had never happened, but they had. She had felt its intent. The apple wasn't just an invitation or a seed. It was an anchor. And as long as it was in her house, the things outside had a way in. They were no longer bound by the rules of the hollow. The boundary had been broken. The hunt was not just beginning. It was already here, inside her home, tapping politely at the door. She knew she couldn't leave it in the cabinet. Hiding it was a temporary, childish solution. The thing in the hollow had shown her its terms. It wanted a trade, a life for a life, a soul for the town's future, and it had chosen Sam. She had to get the apple out of her house. Now, she retrieved it from behind the pots, the cold of it seeping through the towel. She had to take it somewhere, but where? She couldn't go back to the hollow. That was walking directly into its grasp. Arthur was no help. He had passed the burden to her. The police would think she was insane. Her eyes fell on the fireplace. Fire. It was the oldest purifier. She dumped the kindling from the metal bucket and placed the apple inside. She carried it to the hearth, her hands shaking. She crumpled newspaper, stacked logs around the strange fruit, and lit a match. The flames caught, licking hungrily at the dry wood. She watched, praying for the apple to blacken and burst. The fire roared, the logs cracking and spitting. But the apple did not burn. It sat in the heart of the inferno, untouched. The flames seemed to bend around it, refusing to touch its waxy skin. It was immune. It was beyond such simple things. A small sound from the hallway made her spin around. Sam stood there, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, I'm thirsty." Before she could move, his eyes widened, looking past her, out the large living room window. "It's closer," he whispered. Lily turned. The scarecrow was now at the edge of the porch, its face pressed against the glass. Its stuffed body blocked the view of the yard. It wasn't smiling or screaming. Its expression was blank, patient. It was waiting for her to understand that there was no escape. She ran to Sam, pulling him away from the window. "Go to your room right now. Don't come out." "But I'm thirsty." "Now, Sam." He fled, his small footsteps echoing in the hall. Lily grabbed the fireplace poker, its end glowing red-hot, and faced the window. The scarecrow hadn't moved. It just watched. Then the back door knob began to jiggle. Not a tap this time, but a firm, testing turn. The deadbolt held, but the thin wooden door groaned in its frame. It was testing the locks, learning. Lily knew then that the doors wouldn't hold for long. The apple was a beacon, and the things outside were drawn to it like moths to a flame. They would get in. It was only a matter of time. She had one choice left, the one she had refused in the hollow, the bargain. She looked from the apple, cool and perfect in the fire, to the scarecrow's face at the window. It wanted a sacrifice, but it hadn't specified what kind. Arthur said it took what a community feared most to lose. For her, that was Sam. But the town's fear was older, deeper. It was the fear of the land itself turning against them, of starvation returning. A desperate, terrible idea began to form in her mind. It wasn't a child the hollow needed. It was a story. A new story to replace the old, grim one. A story of offering, but not of loss. A story of return. She ran to the kitchen, leaving the poker behind. She took the apple from the fire, its coolness a shock. She found what she needed in the pantry, her movements frantic but sure. She worked quickly, her back to the window, blocking the view of what she was doing. When she was finished, she turned. The scarecrow was still there. Lily held up her new creation. She had impaled the apple on the prongs of a metal corn holder, transforming it into a bizarre, terrible ornament. A new kind of effigy. She walked to the front door, her heart a wild drum in her chest. This was the gamble. This was the new story. She unlocked the door and stepped outside. The air was freezing. The scarecrow on the porch turned its head slowly to follow her movement. She ignored it, walking purposefully to the scarecrow in the center of the yard, the one that had stood vigil for days. Its back was still to her, with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She ripped the old, rotting pumpkin from its post, and let it fall to the ground. In its place, she jammed the corn holder deep into the stake, fixing the apple to the top. It sat there, gleaming under the porch light, a dark, unnatural fruit where a friendly jack-o'-lantern had been. She stepped back, her breath held. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the scarecrow in the yard slowly, stiffly, began to turn. It creaked around on its post until it was facing the woods at the edge of their property. It raised its stuffed arms, as if in offering. All at once, every scarecrow in every yard up and down the street did the same. A silent, synchronized motion. They all turned toward the woods, toward Starvation Hollow, and raised their arms. The scarecrow on her porch dropped down, landing softly on the grass. It did not look at her again. It walked, with a stiff, shuffling gait, past her and into the darkness, following the direction of the others. They were all leaving. They were taking the apple, her offering, back to the source. Lily stood alone in her yard, shaking, watching the retreating figures until they were swallowed by the night. The weight was gone. The silence was just silence. She didn't know how long it would last. A year, a generation. But she knew the story had changed. She had not given it what it wanted. She had given it what it needed. A new ritual. A new way to feed. She went inside, locked the door, and collapsed against it, weeping with relief. She had saved her son, for now. But as she looked out at the empty stake in her yard, she knew the hollow had not been defeated. It had been appeased, and it would always be hungry. She slept on the floor of Sam's room that night, her back against his door, a kitchen knife held loosely in her hand. The dawn came, pale and weak, but it came. The sun revealed an ordinary yard, damp with dew, empty of everything, but a single post where the scarecrow had stood. The town of Ember Hollow, when she dared to look out the front window, was similarly cleansed. The silent watchers were gone from every porch and field. The relief was a physical thing, a warmth that slowly thawed the ice in her veins. She made pancakes for Sam, the normalcy of the act feeling like a miracle. He chattered about his cartoons, his fear of the previous night already fading into the resilient fog of childhood. Lily tried to smile, to match his mood, but her ears were still ringing with the silence of the hollow. By midday, a cautious energy returned to the town. People emerged from their houses, talking in hushed, bewildered tones on their porches. They pointed at the empty stakes and shrugged at one another. There was a collective, unspoken agreement not to question the miracle too closely. The curse was broken. That was enough. Lily knew better. She walked to the edge of town, to the old fence line that separated the known world from the woods. She stared into the tangled gloom. The scarecrows were gone, but the woods were not empty. She could feel it. A patient, abiding presence, sated for now, but watching. Always watching. A week passed. The town began to breathe again. The harvest festival was hastily replanned, not as a desperate plea, but but as a genuine celebration. The air smelled of baking pies and wood smoke, not fear. On the morning of the festival, Lily found a small wicker basket on her front porch. It was filled with perfect crimson apples. There was no note. She picked one up. It was cold and firm. It looked exactly like the one she had taken from Arthur's barn, the one she had offered to the hollow. Her stomach turned. She carried the basket inside and placed it on the kitchen table. She stared at it, this gift from the hungry earth. It was a reminder, a receipt. The bargain was not over. It was eternal. That evening, she and Sam walked to the town square. Paper lanterns were strung between the buildings, and a bonfire crackled in the center. People laughed and talked, their faces illuminated by the warm light. They nodded to Lily with a new, quiet respect. They didn't know what she had done, but they knew she was involved in their deliverance. Sam ran off to join his friends, his small hand letting go of hers without a backward glance. Lily stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the flames. She saw Arthur on the other side of the fire. He met her gaze across the flickering light. He didn't smile. He simply gave a slow, single nod. He understood the cost. He knew the nature of the piece they had bought. The music started, a lively folk tune, and the square filled with dancing. Lily watched the swirling colors, the joyful, oblivious movement. She was part of them, yet utterly separate. She had looked into the heart of the hollow and had her own heart forever altered. She felt a tug on her coat. Sam was back, holding out 2 candy apples, their glossy red surfaces reflecting the firelight. "I got one for you, Mom," he said, beaming. Lily looked at the offered treat, the sweet, sticky symbol of the harvest. For a terrifying second, she didn't see candy. She saw the cold, perfect fruit from the basket on her table. She saw the thing in the hollow, faceless and patient. She took the apple from her son's hand. "Thank you, honey," she said, her voice steady. She held it, feeling the weight of it, the promise and the threat. She would take a bite. She would smile for Sam. She would join the dance. She would play her part in the new story she had written. But she would never forget the old one, or the quiet, watching woods, or the simple, terrible truth she now carried like a stone inside her. The hunger was gone from Ember Hollow, but it was now here inside her, and it would never, ever leave. The candy apple was too sweet. It stuck in her throat, a cloying paste that made it hard to swallow. But she ate it, bite by bite, while Sam chattered about the games he wanted to play. She kept the smile on her face until her cheeks ached. It was the most important performance of her life. Later, as they walked home under a clear, cold sky full of stars, Sam's hand in hers felt different. Not just a comfort, but a responsibility so immense it stole her breath. She was his guardian, not just against traffic and scraped knees, but against a legacy of quiet, patient hunger. She had pulled him back from the edge of one story, only to bind him tighter to another. The house felt different too. It was no longer just a shelter. It was an outpost, She checked the locks out of habit, but the fear was no longer of something breaking in. It was the fear of something she had already let inside, something that lived now in the foundation, in the very soil of the garden. In the days that followed, life resumed its rhythm, but the melody had changed. She found herself studying the land, the way the morning frost lay on the grass, the health of the old oak tree at the property line. She noticed things she never had before. The way certain birds avoided the western edge of the yard, the way the shadows from the woods seemed to stretch just a little farther than they should as the sun set. She kept the basket of apples on the kitchen table. She couldn't bring herself to throw them away. That felt like an insult, a dangerous provocation. One afternoon, almost without thinking, she took one and walked into the backyard. She dug a small hole at the base of the old oak tree, its branches bare and skeletal against the gray sky. She buried the apple there, pushing the cold, dark soil over it with her bare hands. It felt right. It felt like a payment on a debt. A few days later, a single, impossible shoot of green broke through the soil, vibrant and healthy despite the advancing season. Lily looked at it, then at the basket of apples still on her table. They had not rotted. They were as perfect and cold as the day they arrived. She understood then that the bargain was not a single transaction. It was a relationship. She had become the new warden, the keeper of the balance Arthur had once managed. The town slept in blissful ignorance, but she had to stay awake. That night, she dreamed not of the hollow, but of the tree. In the dream, it was full grown, its branches heavy with dark, gleaming fruit. And standing beneath it, not as a stuffed effigy, but as a solid, living figure, was the scarecrow. It didn't move or speak. It simply held out its hand, not in menace, but in expectation. She woke up knowing what she had to do. The story wasn't just hers and Sam's anymore. It was hers and the Hollow's. It was a story they would write together, season after season, harvest after harvest. She got out of bed and went to the window. The yard was empty, the young shoot barely visible in the moonlight. But she was not alone. She could feel the presence in the woods, a vast, ancient consciousness that had accepted her offering and was now waiting for the next chapter to begin. She had saved her son. She had saved the town. But she had bound her own life, and perhaps her son's future, to the quiet, hungry dark. And she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and calm, that the apples on her table were not a gift. They were seeds. Seeds of a story that was only just beginning to grow. Story 2. The first thing Jamarcus noticed was the light next door. It wasn't the steady, electric yellow of a porch bulb, but a wavering, sullen orange, the color of a dying ember. It pulsed from within a jack-o'-lantern perched on the top step of the Forrester house, a place that had stood empty for so long the neighborhood children had forgotten its name and called it the boneyard. The light did not flicker with the cheerful randomness of a candle. It breathed. It swelled and receded like the slow, deep rhythm of a sleeping beast, casting long, grasping shadows from the porch railing that seemed to claw their way across the dry, brown lawn. For 3 nights now, since the last week of October had truly sunk its cold teeth in, that light had been the only sign of life from the house. And Jammerkus, sitting at his own bedroom window, felt it watching him back. Over in Hemlock Creek was a slow, beautiful death. The sugar maples bled crimson and gold, and the oaks turned the color of rust and dried blood. A carpet of brittle leaves covered every sidewalk, and the wind that swept down from the bare-limbed hills carried the scent of wood smoke and decay. It was Jammerkus S. 15th year, the age where Halloween begins to curdle, its magic soured by the realization that you are too old for free candy and too young for the parties where the real masks are worn. For Jammerkus, it was worse. He was a quiet boy, built with the kind of delicate frame that invited cruelty, with a mind that preferred the intricate worlds of his sketchbooks to the brutal simplicity of the school hallway. His Halloween had been stolen from him years ago, replaced by the annual tradition of being the punchline. This year, the whispers had already started. Kyle Dobbs and his friends, their voices cracking with newfound malice, had been practicing. "Hey, Mars, what you gonna be this year? A ghost? You ain't already pale enough." Their laughter was the sound of stones rattling in a tin can. Last year, they had cornered him in the corn maze at the Thompson farm, their faces grotesque behind cheap plastic masks, and stuffed his mouth with rotting pumpkin guts. The smell, that foul, sweet, and earthy stench, had haunted him for months. He could still taste it sometimes, a phantom bitterness on his tongue. He was watching the breathing light of the jack-o'-lantern when he saw her for the first time. A small figure emerged from the front door of the Forrester house, a girl who looked to be about 12. She was pale, almost luminous in the twilight, her hair a shock of black that fell like a curtain of ink around her shoulders. She wore a simple, old-fashioned black dress. She didn't skip or run like a child, but walked to the edge of the porch with a preternatural stillness and looked directly at his window. Her eyes, even from this distance, seemed to absorb the strange light from the pumpkin, holding it in their dark depths. She lifted a hand, not a wave, but a slow, deliberate acknowledgement. Then she was gone, retreating back into the dark mouth of the house, and the pulsing orange glow from the jack-o'-lantern seemed to quicken for a moment, like a satisfied heartbeat. The next day was Saturday, the 28th. The air was sharp with the promise of frost. Jammerkus, driven by a loneliness deeper than his fear, found himself standing at the property line, staring at the Forrester house. The girl was sitting on the bottom step, carefully carving another pumpkin. The guts, stringy and studded with seeds, were piled in a metal bowl beside her. "You ray not using a pattern," Jammerkus said, his voice too loud in the quiet morning. She didn't look up. Her hands, small and precise, worked the paring knife with an artist-esque grace. Patterns are lies. They tell the face what to be. This one already has a face inside. I am just letting it out. The face she was revealing was not a happy one. It was a twisted snarl, one eye squinted shut, the other a wide, asymmetrical triangle. It looked like it was in pain. "I am Jammerkus." "I know," she said. Finally, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes were indeed dark, but not simply brown. They were the color of rich, turned earth, of shadows in a deep wood. "I am Christina. This is Christopher." An old man appeared in the doorway then, as if summoned. He was tall and stooped, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his hands gnarled like the roots of an ancient tree. He wore a simple work shirt and trousers, and his eyes, a faded, weary blue, settled on Jammerkus with a weight that felt physical. "Christina," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "It's cold. You should come inside." "In a minute," she replied, not looking away from Jammerkus. Christopher S. gaze lingered for a moment longer, a silent warning, before he retreated back into the gloom. "He takes care of me," Christina explained, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. She scooped a handful of pumpkin innards from the bowl. The waxy, vegetal smell filled the air between them. "Do you want to help? You can put the candle in." He did. He took the small votive candle she offered and pushed it into the cavern she had hollowed out. His fingers brushed against the cold, slick flesh inside. She struck a match, the scent of sulfur, a brief, sharp ghost, and lit the wick. The light that bloomed within the snarling face was not the same as the one from the previous night's pumpkin. This one was frantic, a trapped, angry fire. "It doesn't breathe," he observed quietly. Christina smiled, a small, secretive thing. "Not all of them do. Only the special ones. The ones that are listening. Their friendship, if that was the word for it, began in those liminal hours after school, and before the early October dark fell completely. Jammerkus would cross the line of crunchy, brown leaves that separated his mundane world from hers. Christina never went to school. She was homeschooled, Christopher said. She was delicate. She spoke in a way that was both childish and ancient, her knowledge of the world seemingly pieced together from old books and older instincts. She loved the Halloween season. It's when the world gets thin, she told him one afternoon as they walked through the woods behind their houses. The ground was a mosaic of fallen leaves, and the bare branches above clicked together like skeletal fingers, like old parchment. You can almost see through to the other side. Can you feel it? He could. The air itself felt different, charged with a silent, waiting energy. The laughter of other children trick-or-treating in the neighboring streets sounded distant and distorted, as if coming from another dimension. The decorations on the houses, the plastic skeletons, the stretched synthetic cobwebs seemed less like pretend, and more like glimpses of a truth that was usually hidden. He told her about Kyle Dobbs. He meant to, but the words spilled out one day as they sat on her porch. The smell of burning leaves from a neighbor's yard hanging in the air like a shroud. He told her about the pumpkin guts, the shoves in the hallway, the names scratched onto his locker. Christina listened, her dark eyes fixed on him, absorbing his pain. She didn't offer pity or platitudes. When he was finished, she was silent for a long time, her small hand resting on the porch step between them. "Everything needs to feed, Jamarcus," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "The trees feed on the sun. The earth feeds on the fallen leaves. It's the way of the world. Some things just have a sharper hunger." On the 30th, the day before Halloween, the tension in Hemlock Creek was a palpable thing. The sun set before 5, and an enormous, lopsided harvest moon rose, its orange glow sickly and oppressive. Jack-o'-lanterns lined every porch, a legion of leering and grinning sentinels. The wind had picked up, carrying whispers that might have been just the wind, and a cold, damp fog began to coil through the streets, mingling with the fake fog from a dozen store-bought machines. That night, Kyle Dobbs and his 2 friends, emboldened by the anarchic spirit of the season and a 6-pack of beer stolen from a Father S. garage, decided the boneyard needed a visit. Jamarcus, from his window, saw them coming. They moved with the swaggering clumsiness of drunk teenagers, their figures distorted by the thickening mist. One of them carried a baseball bat. "Hey, freaks," Kyle yelled, his voice slurred, echoing in the silent street. "Come out and play. We got a treat for you." They started with the pumpkins. Kyle swung the bat, connecting with a sickening crunch. Orange pulp and guttering candlelight exploded across the porch. The light died with a hiss. They laughed, a raw, ugly sound. Jamarcus S. heart hammered against his ribs. He wanted to run, to call the police, but he was frozen, a spectator to his own recurring nightmare. Then the front door of the Forrester house opened. It was Christopher who stood there, not Christina. He held no weapon. His hands were empty at his sides. "You should go home, boys," the old man said, his rustle of a voice carrying an unexpected authority. "It is not a good night to be out." "Or what, old man?" Kyle sneered, taking a step up onto the porch. "You gonna tell our moms?" Christopher didn't answer. He simply looked at them, his weary eyes seeming to deepen, to darken. The fog around the boys seemed to grow denser, coiling around their legs like cold, damp serpents. The remaining jack-o'-lantern on the porch step, the one with the snarling face Jamarcus had helped create, began to pulse. Its light swelled, a deep, bloody orange, and the shadows it cast did not dance. They stretched. They elongated, peeling away from the porch railing and the walls, becoming tall, thin shapes that had no source. The laughter died in the boys' throats. The one with the bat dropped it with a clatter that was shockingly loud in the sudden silence. The shadows converged on them. They were not solid, but they had weight. Jamarcus saw Kyle gasp, his hands flying to his throat as if the very air were being squeezed from him. The boys stumbled back, their faces masks of a terror that was no longer playful. They turned and fled into the fog, their screams swallowed by the oppressive night. Christopher stood on the porch for a moment longer. Then he turned and looked directly at Jamarcus S. window. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Then he went inside and closed the door. The snarling jack-o'-lantern-esque light steadied into a normal, flickering candle flame. The shadows were just shadows again. Halloween day dawned cold and gray, the sky the color of wet ash. Jamarcus felt the date in his bones, a deep, resonant dread. School was a blur of forced festivity and whispered rumors about what had happened to Kyle Dobbs, who was absent, his parents telling the school he was home with a sudden, severe fever. Jamarcus walked home alone, the dead leaves skittering around his feet like anxious insects. The whole town was holding its breath, waiting for the magic hour, for the veil to thin. He found Christina in her backyard, standing before a small, gnarled apple tree. The ground was littered with fallen fruit, brown and rotten. She held a perfect, gleaming red apple in her hand. "It's time for the feast," she said, without turning around. "The harvest. What happened last night?" Jamarcus asked, his voice trembling. Christopher protected what is his. What is ours? She finally turned to face him. She looked different. Paler, her eyes darker, the pupils wide and deep. There was a new sharpness to her features, a quiet, focused hunger. "You are my friend, Jamarcus. You shared your pain with me. I want to share my nature with you." She held out the apple. "Take it. It's a gift." He hesitated. The apple was too red, too perfect, like something from a fairy tale. A warning bell clanged in the deepest part of his mind. "What are you?" he whispered. "We are the things that waited on the other side of the veil," she said softly. "The old things, the hungry things. And on this night, when the world is thin, we can cross over. We can feed. Some of us need an anchor, a guide, a friend." He understood then. The breathing lights in the pumpkins were not just listening. They were calling. Christopher was not just a caretaker, he was a shepherd. And Christina was the harvest. The candy, Jamarcus said, the pieces clicking into place with a terrible, final logic. "The treats it's not just candy, is it?" "It is an offering," Christina said. "A tribute. A little bit of life given freely. It is enough most years for a taste to sustain us. But a real offering, a willing one that is a feast." Her eyes were fixed on him, and in their dark depths he saw not a monster, but a lonely, eternal child, as isolated as he was. She had chosen him not just as a friend, but as a participant, an accomplice. The sun dipped below the horizon. The magic hour began. All along the street, porch lights winked on. Children emerged from houses, transformed into ghosts and goblins and superheroes, their parents trailing behind them with flashlights. The air filled with the sounds of laughter and the rustle of costumes and the repeated chime of doorbells. Jamarcus stood with Christina on her porch. Christopher stood behind them in the doorway, a silent, solemn figure. They watched the children go from house to house, holding out their bags, chanting the ancient phrase. Jamarcus saw Kyle Dobbs' house. It was dark. No porch light. No pumpkins. A silent, fearful offering of its own. Christina held a large, ornate bronze bowl filled with expensive-looking chocolates. As the trick-or-treaters approached, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear of the boneyard, she would drop a single piece into their bags. She didn't speak. She only smiled her small, secret smile. And each time a piece of candy left her hand and landed in a bag, the child would flinch, as if touched by something cold, and their laughter would catch in their throat for just a second before they scurried away. Jamarcus watched it all through a new lens. He saw the ritual for what it was. The children, in their masks, were playing at being monsters, unaware that a real one was giving them a sweet, dark blessing. The candy was a marker, a communion. Later, when the streets began to quiet, and the moon, now a hard, white coin, rose high in the sky, Christina took his hand. Her skin was cold. "It's time," she said. They walked out into the night, leaving Christopher on the porch. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, turning the familiar street into a phantom landscape. The jack-o'-lanterns were guttering out, one by one, their faces sagging in the heat, their light dying. The festive atmosphere was leaching away, replaced by the ancient, cold silence of All Hallows' Eve. Christina led him to the center of the street and stopped. She closed her eyes and tilted her head back, breathing in the cold air. And she began to change. It was not a transformation of flesh and bone, not in the way of movies. It was a transformation of presence. The shadows around her deepened, pooling at her feet and stretching up into the mist. The air grew colder. The few remaining working streetlights flickered and died. From the houses around them, from the bags of candy carried by every child in Hemlock Creek, a faint, shimmering vapor began to rise. It was a silvery, ethereal mist, the color of moonlight on water. It was life. It was spirit. It was the offering. The mist flowed through the fog, drawn to Christina like iron filings to a magnet. It coiled around her, and she breathed it in. Her small form seemed to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light. She was feeding the harvest. Jamarcus watched, his own breath catching in his chest. He felt no fear now, only a profound, terrifying awe. This was her secret. This was her survival. She was a creature of the threshold, feasting on the liminal energy of the night, on the tiny, willing sacrifices of the town's children. When it was over, the silvery mist was gone. The street was dark and quiet and utterly still. Christina opened her eyes. They were no longer just dark. They were full of a cold, satisfied light, like distant stars. She looked sated. She looked peaceful. She turned to Jamarcus and smiled, a genuine, grateful smile. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not running away." He just nodded, unable to speak. He had found a connection, just as he had longed for. It was not the one he had imagined, but it was real. It was a bond forged in loneliness and sealed in the dark magic of the season. He was no longer just the bullied boy, the victim. He was the friend of the thing that walked on the thin nights. He was the keeper of a secret written in shadow and blood, and the last, dying breath of autumn. The images began to blur then, the sharp edges of the world softening, as if seen through a pane of old, wet glass. The dark outline of the Forrester house, the skeletal trees, Christina's pale face, they all started to waver and lose their substance. The cold air lost its bite, becoming a gentle chill. The memory of the night, the terror and the wonder, began to recede, not forgotten, but folded away into the deep, quiet places of the mind, like a dream upon waking. The last thing he saw was the glow of a single, steady candle in a jack-o'-lantern, a tiny, watchful eye in the immense darkness, and then it too faded, vanishing into the soft, silent nothing from which all stories come and to which they all must eventually return. He woke to the sound of rain, a soft, steady patter against his window. For a long time, Jammerkus lay still, the events of the previous night feeling both impossibly vivid and distant, like a story he had read in a book long ago. The fear was a dull echo. The awe, however, remained, a solid, quiet weight in his chest. Downstairs, the world was trying to be normal. His mother was humming along to the radio, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the house. The calendar on the wall now showed November. The bright, garish orange of October had been replaced by the muted browns of a dead month. "You were out late," his mother said, not looking up from the stove. "Did you have a good Halloween?" He looked at her, really looked at her. She was just a person, living in a world of simple causes and effects. She had no idea that the strange, quiet girl next door was something else entirely, or that the candy she had handed out to 24 children had been part of an ancient, necessary ritual. It was different, he said, and it was the truest thing he could manage. He went to the window. The Forrester house stood silent and dark in the gray morning light, its windows like blind eyes. The pumpkins on the porch were collapsed in on themselves, soggy and blackened, their fierce faces melted into shapeless pulp. There was no sign of Christina or Christopher. A part of him expected everything to be different, for the world itself to have been remade by what he had witnessed. But the street was just a wet street. The trees were just bare trees. The magic had withdrawn, and the veil had thickened once more, leaving behind the mundane reality of a November morning. He saw Kyle Dobbs that Monday. He was back in school, but the swagger was gone. He walked with his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he passed Jammerkus in the hallway, he flinched, a quick, almost imperceptible spasm of fear. Didn't he meet his eyes? The bullying had ended. It hadn't been defeated, it had been harvested, replaced by a deeper, more primal understanding. Jammerkus and Christina did not speak of it again. Their friendship settled into a new, unspoken rhythm. They still met in the afternoons, but the conversations were lighter, about books or the weather. The dark, hungry heart of her existence was now a known fact between them, a truth so immense it needed no discussion. Christopher would sometimes bring them mugs of hot cider, his gnarled hands steady, his faded blue eyes resting on Jammerkus with a kind of weary acceptance. He was no longer a threat, but a fellow guardian of a terrible and wonderful secret. Winter came, laying a thick blanket of snow over Hemlock Creek, muffling the world in silence. The Forrester house seemed to hibernate, its outlines softened by snowdrifts. Christina seemed paler, quieter, as if conserving her energy. The vibrant life she had consumed on Halloween was sustaining her through the long, lean season of concealment. One afternoon in late December, as they sat by his window watching the snow fall, Christina pointed to a sparrow huddled on a bare branch, its feathers puffed up against the cold. "It is so small," she said, her voice soft. "Its life is so brief and bright. A little pulse of warmth in all this cold." She looked at Jamarcus, her earth-dark eyes thoughtful. "That is all any of it is, really. Just little pulses of warmth. Some are just hungrier for it than others." He finally understood the loneliness he had seen in her that first day. It was the loneliness of a predator that understood its prey too well, that needed them, loved their vibrant, fleeting light, even as it fed on them to survive. When spring finally arrived, the first brave green shoots pushing through the wet earth, Christina seemed to revive with the season. Her cheeks gained a faint blush of color, and she spent more time outside, her hands buried in the newly thawed soil of their overgrown garden. Jamarcus stood at the property line, the sun warm on his back for the first time in months. He watched her, this strange girl who was his friend, this ancient creature in a child-s body. He thought of the coming autumn, of the next Halloween, and the one after that. He knew then that he would be there. He would stand with her on the porch, and he would watch the children come, and he would understand the true price of the candy in their bags. He was no longer an outsider looking in. He was part of the ritual now. He was a keeper of the thin places, a friend to the harvest, and in the quiet, lonely corners of his world, he had finally found a family. The summer passed in a haze of heat and quiet understanding. Jamarcus mowed lawns for pocket money, and sometimes Christina would sit on the curb and watch him, her knees drawn up to her chin. She never seemed to feel the heat. Flies would buzz around his head, but they never landed on her. He noticed things like that now. The small absences, the quiet ways the world bent around her. One evening in late August, they were in the boneyard, digging for night crawlers in the damp soil under an old slate slab. Christopher had asked for them, something about the garden. Jamarcus S. hands were covered in dirt, but Christina S. remained pale and clean. She unearthed a large, fat worm, its body glistening in the twilight. It twisted in her grasp. "Look," she whispered, holding it up. So much life in such a simple thing. She didn't put it in the can with the others. She held it for a moment longer, her gaze intense, and then she laid it gently back on the soil. It lay still for a second before burrowing frantically back into the dark earth. "Sometimes you can take just a little," she said, wiping her clean hands on her dress. "A taste, enough to remember what it feels like." The first leaves began to turn in early September. A restlessness settled over the Forresters. Christopher was seen patching cracks in the porch foundation with a dark, pungent mortar. Christina started spending more time alone in the woods at the end of the street, returning with her arms full of strange, twisted branches and bundles of dried weeds. Jamarcus knew better than to ask what they were for. He was helping Christopher carry a new bag of soil into the shed when he saw them, stacked neatly in a dark corner behind a dusty old lawnmower were half a dozen new pumpkins. They were still a pale, greenish-white, but their shapes were perfect, almost aggressively so. Getting a head start, Christopher said, his voice a dry rustle. He saw Jamarcus looking. The best ones need time to settle in, to absorb the atmosphere. The air in the shed was cold, much colder than it should have been. Jamarcus just nodded and hurried back out into the late summer sun. On the first day of school, a new girl arrived. Her name was Lacey, and she had just moved from the city. She was loud and confident, with a laugh that cut through the quiet murmur of the hallway. She was assigned the desk next to Jamarcus in homeroom. She smiled at him, a bright, easy, normal smile. For a fleeting moment, he felt the pull of that normalcy, the simple, sunlit world where girls were just girls and pumpkins were just vegetables. He introduced her to few people. At lunch, she sat with him and a couple of his cautious acquaintances. She talked about her old school, about movies, about music. Her world was so wide and bright, so unburdened by ancient secrets. He found himself laughing at one of her jokes, a real, genuine laugh that felt foreign in his chest. After school, he walked home with her, as their houses were in the same direction. She lived 3 streets over from the boneyard. As they approached his street, he felt a familiar prickle on the back of his neck. Christina was sitting on her porch steps, perfectly still, watching them. Her expression was unreadable. "Who asked that?" Lacey asked, her voice full of casual curiosity. "That's Christina. She lives next door. She looks intense," Lacey said. And then she waved, a big, friendly city girl wave. "Hi." Christina did not wave back. She didn't move at all. She just watched them pass, her dark eyes fixed on Jamarcus. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He knew that look. It was the same look she had given the sparrow in the winter, a look of quiet, focused assessment. He made an excuse to Lacey and turned up his walkway. When he looked back, Christina was gone from the steps, but he could feel her, a presence just beyond the veil of the ordinary world, waiting. The harvest was coming, and he had just shown a potential new offering to the keeper of the boneyard. The easy laughter of the afternoon felt like a betrayal, and the familiar weight of his secret settled back onto his shoulders, heavier than ever. The next few days were a tightrope walk. Lacey sought him out at school, her presence a bubble of noisy, cheerful reality. She invited him to a movie on Friday with a group of people. A normal Friday night. He almost said yes. The word was on his tongue, a simple 2-letter escape. But then he'd go home and see Christina in her yard, not gardening, just standing, her face tilted toward the fading sun. She never asked about Lacey. She didn't he have to. The question hung in the air between them, as tangible as the autumn chill. "Who are you going to be?" it whispered. "Which world do you choose?" On Thursday, he found a small, smooth stone on his windowsill. It was black, shot through with a single, jagged vein of white. It was cold to the touch, even though it had been sitting in the sun. He knew it was from her. A reminder, a token. He told Lacey he go to the movie. He said he was sick. It wasn't he a complete lie. The conflict made him feel physically ill. He spent Friday evening in his room, the black stone a heavy weight in his palm. He heard his parents laughing at a show downstairs. He heard the wind picking up outside, rattling the last of the dry leaves. He felt the two halves of his life pulling him apart. A soft tap came at his window. He knew who it was before he looked. Christina was standing on the branch of the old oak, her face a pale moon in the deepening gloom. He opened the window. "You ray not sick," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "No." She looked past him into his room, at the posters of bands and galaxies, the scattered homework, the ordinary debris of a boy's life. "It's hard for you," she said. "The in-between. I forget that sometimes. She's just a girl," Jamarcus said, the words feeling weak and inadequate. "I know," Christina replied, "and I am not. That is the choice." She held out her hand. "Come with me. Christopher is lighting the first of the new candles. They need to know your scent. They need to know you are still ours. Ours." The word landed with the force of a physical blow. He looked at her outstretched hand, then back at the warm, lit rectangle of his bedroom door. He thought of Lacey's easy laugh. He thought of the silvery mist rising from 1,000 bags of candy, and the profound, terrible peace on Christina's face as she drank it in. He took her hand. Her skin was like the stone, cool and smooth. He climbed out the window and onto the branch, the bark rough beneath his fingers. Together, they climbed down into the waiting dark, leaving the warmth of his house behind. The choice was made. The harvest would not wait. The air in the forester shed was thick with the smell of cold earth and melting wax. Christopher was there, his large, stooped form moving slowly and deliberately. He had arranged the pale pumpkins in a circle, and in the center of each, he had carved a small, shallow bowl. He was using a long, black match to light a wick that floated in a pool of dark, golden liquid inside the first one. The flame caught, not with a cheerful yellow glow, but with a low, blue-tinged fire that gave off no heat. "This is the anointing," Christina whispered, her hand still cold in Jamarcus's. "The wick is woven from last year's vines. The oil is pressed from seeds that have never seen the sun." Christopher looked up as they entered, his eyes reflecting the strange, cold flames. He gave a slow, deliberate nod to Jamarcus, a gesture of solemn welcome. He then gestured for Jamarcus to come closer. "You must breathe on the flame," Christina instructed softly. Just a whisper of your breath. It needs to know the warmth of your life. It needs to remember you. Jamarcus stepped forward, his heart thudding against his ribs. He leaned over the pumpkin, the blue flame casting shifting shadows on his face. He could feel the unnatural cold radiating from it. He parted his lips and exhaled gently, a soft cloud in the chill air. The flame wavered, flickered, and for a moment it seemed to lean toward him, turning a fraction warmer, a hint of gold entering its core, before settling back into its cold, blue state. Christopher grunted in approval and moved to the next pumpkin. One by one, Jamarcus repeated the ritual. With each soft breath he gave, he felt a little more of his own vitality, his own connection to the warm, living world, being woven into the fabric of their preparations. He was not just a witness anymore. He was a participant, his own life force becoming a thread in the tapestry of the coming night. When the last flame was lit and acknowledged, Christopher extinguished them all with a pinch of his fingers, not seeming to feel any pain. The shed was plunged into a darkness that felt deeper and more profound than before. "It is done," Christina said. She squeezed Jamarcus's hand once, then let go. "Now it knows you. Now you are part of the welcome and part of the gathering." He walked back to his house under a sky dense with stars, feeling fundamentally altered. The decision was no longer a weight on his shoulders, but a truth in his bones. The next day at school, he was quiet. When Lacey bounded up to him, full of stories about the movie, and asking if he was feeling better, he gave her a small, distant smile. "I'm okay," he said. "It's just a family thing." Her face fell just for a second before her bright resilience took over. "Oh, okay. Maybe next time." "Yeah," he said, but they both knew there wouldn't be a next time. He watched her walk away, a vibrant pulse of warmth in the crowded hallway, and he felt a pang of loss, sharp and clean. But it was the loss of something that was never truly his to have. He had chosen the cold, certain dark over the fleeting, confusing light. He had chosen his family. The following week, the pumpkins were brought up from the shed and placed on the Forrester porch. They were no longer pale and green, but had ripened to a deep, venomous orange. Their carved faces were not the simple triangles and jagged smiles of ordinary jack-o'-lanterns. These were spirals and keyholes and shapes that suggested mouths open in a silent, endless scream. They were unsettling to look at, and Jamarcus noticed that the neighborhood kids, even the bold ones, gave the Forrester house a wide berth now. Lacey tried one more time. She caught him at his locker, her usual confidence tempered with a hint of genuine concern. "You've been really quiet, Jamarcus. Is everything okay with you? And your neighbor?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a good person. A normal person. The kind of person who would call for help if she knew what he knew, who would try to save him, and in doing so, unravel everything. She existed in a world where things like the Forresters were monsters to be defeated. He lived in a world or they were simply a different kind of fact. "Everything's fine," he said, his voice even and calm. "Christina's just, my friend. It's complicated." The word complicated was a wall, and Lacey, smart and perceptive, finally understood it was one she could not climb. She nodded slowly, a flicker of sadness in her eyes, and then she turned and walked away for good. On Halloween night, the air was perfectly still and cold, the sky a clear, hard black. Jamarcus did not put on a costume. He ate dinner with his parents, helped hand out candy at their door for an hour, and then told them he was going next door to help the foresters. "Those carvings are something else this year," his father said, shaking his head with a chuckle. "Tell Christopher he's got a real talent for the spooky stuff." Jamarcus just nodded and stepped out into the night. The transition was immediate. The cheerful, chaotic energy of his own street faded with every step he took toward the forester property line. The sounds of laughter and shouting children became muffled, as if heard from a great distance. By the time he reached the porch, the world was silent. Christina was waiting for him, dressed in a simple, dark dress. Christopher stood behind her, a silent sentinel. The pumpkins were lit, but their flames were that same cold, blue-tinged fire from the shed, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. "Ready?" Christina asked. He nodded. The first group of children approached, their parents waiting at the end of the walkway. They were small, dressed as superheroes and princesses, their bags held open with trusting expectation. Christopher dropped the candy into their bags with a soft, rustling sound. As they turned to leave, chattering about the next house, Jamarcus watched. He saw it now, clearly. A faint, shimmering vapor, like a breath on a cold morning, rose from their bags and was drawn, not by the wind, but by an unseen current, toward Christina. She closed her eyes for a brief second, a subtle, almost serene smile touching her lips as she absorbed the tiny, fleeting essence of their Halloween joy. He felt no horror, only a strange, protective solemnity. He was not a victim, nor was he a predator. He was a guardian at the gate, ensuring the ancient, necessary exchange proceeded smoothly and quietly. He was part of the mechanism that allowed the strange girl next door to live, and in turn, that allowed his own world to retain its fragile, beautiful normalcy. He watched the children run back to their parents, completely unaware of the small, invisible toll they had paid, and he understood his place in it all. He was home, the night wore on, and the parade of costumed children continued. Jamarcus found a rhythm to it, a quiet cadence in the ritual. He watched the shimmer rise from the bags, 1,000 little sighs of excitement and sugar-fueled bravery, all flowing into Christina. She stood, a still, dark root drinking from a scattered rain. Near the end of the night, a lone figure trudged up the walk. It was a tall, awkward teenager, too old for trick-or-treating, wearing a faded superhero shirt and a look of defiant embarrassment. He thrust his pillowcase forward without a word. Christopher dropped a handful of candy into it with the same solemnity he had shown the toddlers. As the teenager turned, Jamarcus saw the mist that rose from his bag was different. It was thinner, paler, tinged with the gray of self-consciousness, and the bittersweet acknowledgement that this was probably his last year. It was a more complex flavor, and Christina's intake of breath was sharper, her eyes opening for a moment to watch the boy shuffle away. She looked thoughtful. When the last porch light on the street winked out, Christopher went inside without a word. The blue flames in the pumpkins guttered and died, leaving them as hollow, dark-eyed skulls. The silence that remained was absolute. Christina finally moved, sinking down to sit on the top step. She looked tired, but the deep, hollowed-out loneliness he had seen in her during the winter was gone. She was sated. It was a good harvest, she said, her voice soft in the profound quiet. Jamarcus sat beside her. He could still feel the echo of the night, a faint, cold energy thrumming in the air around them. That older kid, he began, unsure how to phrase the question. The last ones are always interesting, she said, looking out at the dark, empty street. They know it's an ending. There's a different kind of life in that knowledge. A little sad, but strong. She turned her head to look at him. Like you were last year, standing on the edge. He understood. He had been a potential harvest once too. Now he was something else. What happens now? He asked. Now we rest. The winter is for us, for you to be a boy, and for me to be quiet. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of simple, profound trust. Her hair smelled of cold air and fallen leaves, and when the spring comes, you will help me in the garden. Not just the weeding, the real garden, the one that prepares the soil for these. She gestured to the spent pumpkins. He put his arm around her, and they sat in the dark, watching the stars wheel overhead. The world was asleep, dreaming simple, untroubled dreams, completely unaware of the two quiet figures on the porch of the old house, the keepers of the balance, the friends of the harvest, waiting together for the dawn. The first frost came a week later, silvering the rooftops and the skeletal branches of the trees. Jamarcus woke to a world made quiet and sharp. He saw Christina from his window, standing in her backyard, her dark coat making her a stark cutout against the white-dusted grass. She wasn't looking at the frost, but at the ground, as if she could see through the frozen crust to the sleeping things below. School felt more distant than ever. He walked the halls like a ghost, observing the dramas and anxieties of his classmates with a detached curiosity. Their concerns were so immediate, so fleeting. Lacey was dating a boy from the soccer team. She waved at him once, a brief, polite gesture, and he returned it, feeling nothing but a vague, nostalgic ache for the person he had been when he met her. One Saturday in November, Christopher appeared at his back door, a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. "The soil needs amending," he said, his voice like the rustle of dry corn husks. "Before the ground locks solid, Jammarcus pulled on his coat and followed him to the boneyard. The garden was a patch of bare, black earth, the dead stalks of the giant sunflowers looking like ancient monuments. Christopher handed him a trowel and pointed to a specific patch of ground near the center. Dig here, 6 inches down. You will find stones. Bring them all to me. The earth was cold and hard, but Jammarcus worked at it, the physical labor a welcome focus for his mind. After a few minutes, his trowel hit something with a clink. He brushed away the dirt and found not a rough fieldstone, but a smooth, oval rock, dark gray and veined with silver. He dug further and found more. They were all similar, all unnaturally smooth and cool to the touch, and they were arranged in a loose spiral pattern. He collected them in a small pile and brought them to Christopher, who was sorting through the contents of his sack. It was full of grayish-white powder that looked like ash, but smelled of ozone and something metallic, like old pennies. Christopher took the stones one by one, examining them. "Good," he muttered. "They've absorbed the season's vigor." He began crushing them with a small, heavy pestle, grinding them down into a fine, glittering dust, which he then mixed with the ash from his sack. "This is the foundation," Christopher explained, his movements slow and precise. "The memory of the harvest, the promise of the frost. It feeds what sleeps below." He handed Jammarcus a bucket of the mixture and instructed him to sprinkle it evenly over the entire garden. As the dust settled onto the dark soil, Jammarcus felt a subtle shift in the air, a deep, resonant quiet, like the earth itself was taking a long, slow breath and holding it. He was not just cleaning a garden. He was tucking it in, singing it a lullaby made of stone and ash. When they were finished, Christina was there, holding 2 mugs of steaming cider. She handed one to Jammarcus. Their fingers brushed, and hers were warm for the first time he could remember. "You see," she said softly, looking out over the treated earth. "It's not just taking, it's a cycle, a conversation." He sipped the cider. It was sweet and sharp with cinnamon, a taste of the normal human world. But as he stood there between the silent, ancient man and the girl who fed on magic, the 2 tastes didn't seem to conflict. They were just different parts of the same season, the same world. He was part of the conversation now, a quiet word in the long, slow sentence that was the life of the boneyard. And for the first time, it felt like enough. The cider was gone, but the warmth lingered in his chest as he walked back to his own house. His mother was baking, and the smell of chocolate chip cookies filled the kitchen, a stark, wholesome contrast to the ozone and ash of the garden. She smiled at him, flour dusting her cheek, helping Christopher with his winter prep. She asked, sliding a tray of cookies onto the stovetop. "Yeah," Jammarcus said, and the word felt true in a way it never had before. He wasn't lying. He was just speaking a different dialect of the truth, one his mother could understand. He took a cookie, still warm and gooey, and went up to his room. From his window, he could see the boneyard, a neat, dark square waiting under the pale November sky. It didn't look strange or ominous anymore. It just looked like what it was, a piece of land with a purpose, resting. He thought about the stones he had dug up, their cool weight in his hand, the memory of the harvest locked inside them. He thought of them now, ground to dust and mixed with ash, a blanket for whatever slept below. His phone buzzed. A group chat was blowing up about a party that weekend. He scanned the messages, the frantic energy of the plans feeling like noise from a distant country. He typed a quick, "Can't make it, family stuff," and put the phone face down. There was no conflict in the decision, no pull from the other side. His life had simply recentered itself, the axis point shifting from the middle of the school hallway to the dark soil of the garden next door. A few days later, a different kind of harvest arrived. The first real snow fell, thick and silent, burying the world in a soft, white hush. That night, Christina tapped on his window again. The snow was still falling, and she stood on the branch, a dark silhouette against the swirling white. "Come on," she said, her breath a pale plume. "It's time for the first silence." He followed her into the Forrester backyard. The snow was pristine, untouched. Christopher was already there, standing at the edge of the boneyard. He held 3 small, carved wooden cups. He scooped up fresh, clean snow from an area far from the garden, packing it into each cup, then handed one to Christina and one to Jamarcus. The 3 of them stood in a triangle at the border of the black earth. The only sound was the soft, almost imperceptible whisper of the falling snow. Christopher raised his cup. Christina did the same. Jamarcus followed. In unison, they tilted their cups and let the unmelted snow fall onto the garden. It was a silent toast, a libation of pure cold. As the snow touched the ashen stone-amended soil, Jamarcus felt a deep, resonant quiet settle over the land, a peace so profound it felt like a sound in itself. The garden was not dead. It was dreaming, and they were its guardians, honoring its rest. Looked at Christina. Snowflakes caught in her dark hair like tiny stars. She wasn't a pale moon or a dark root in that moment. She was just a girl in the snow, sharing a secret with him. And he was just a boy who finally understood it. The in-between wasn't a place of being torn apart. It was a bridge, and he was learning how to walk it. The winter deepened, and the silence around the Forrester house became a tangible presence. Jamarcus found his own life settling into its new, quieter rhythm. He did his homework, helped shovel the driveway, and watched movies with his parents. The ordinary acts felt like rituals of their own, grounding him in the world he had chosen to protect. He started spending most evenings next door. There were no more grand rituals, just the quiet company of the Forresters. He would sit with Christina in the living room while she read from old, leather-bound books filled with botanical drawings that seemed to shift under the lamplight. Christopher would often be in his workshop, the sound of his carving tools, a soft, rhythmic scraping that was as much a part of the house's atmosphere as the scent of dried herbs and cold earth. One evening in late December, Christina closed her book and looked at him, her head tilted. "You're not afraid of the quiet anymore," she observed. It wasn't a question. He thought about it. The frantic noise of his old life, the need to be constantly surrounded by people and sound, felt like a memory from someone else's childhood. "No," he said, "I'm not." "It's because you are part of it now," she said. "The quiet isn't empty. It's full of waiting. You can feel it, can't you? The potential." He could. It was like the feeling in the air before a thunderstorm, but stretched thin and deep over the entire season. It was the potential of what was sleeping in the boneyard, of what was gathering in the long, dark nights. On the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, Christopher led them down into the root cellar beneath the kitchen. It was a place Jamarcus had never been, a low-ceilinged space that smelled powerfully of damp soil and preserved things. In the center of the packed earth floor, surrounded by jars of pickled vegetables and bins of potatoes, was a single dormant pumpkin vine, its leaves pale and dry. Nestled among the leaves was one last, small, perfectly white pumpkin. Christopher knelt, his joints cracking in the stillness, and gently cradled the white gourd. He produced a knife with a bone handle and carved a single, intricate symbol into its side, a spiral contained within a circle. He did not light it. Instead, he placed it back on the cold earth. "This is the anchor," Christina whispered to Jamarcus. "It holds the dream of the harvest through the deepest dark. It remembers the light so the rest of us can rest." They stood in silence for a long time, watching the pale, unlit pumpkin in the glow of the single bare bulb overhead. Jamarcus felt the rightness of it settle into him. This was the other side of the Halloween frenzy. This was the necessary stillness, the deep breath held. He was learning the whole year, not just the single night. He was learning the language of the soil in its every season, and with each passing day, the words became more familiar, until they started to feel like his own. Story 3. It began not with a sound, but with a chill. I was carving the third pumpkin, the big one with the lopsided stem we de-picked from Miller S. Farm, my fingers slick with its cold, stringy guts. The kitchen was warm, filled with the sweet, spiced scent of the pie my wife, Clara, had left cooling on the stovetop before she'd taken Josh up for his bath. The radio played some tinny, cheerful song about monsters mashing. And then, right there in the center of the room, the air changed. It was a pocket of absolute cold, a sudden, deep winter that had no business inside our insulated walls. It wasn't a draft. It was a presence, a void that drank the heat from the space it occupied. I felt it on the back of my neck, a dry, physical ice that had nothing to do with the October evening cooling outside. It lasted only a moment, 3 heartbeats at most, and then it was gone, leaving only the memory of its bite and the faint, waxy smell of a snuffed-out candle. I shook my head, blaming it on fatigue, on the latent strangeness of the season. It was October 28th. The air was supposed to be getting thinner. The next day, the news was full of it. Not the cold, but the consequences. A mass hallucination in Chicago, they called it. People collapsing in the streets, their core body temperatures plummeting for no discernible reason. A geological anomaly off the coast of Japan, a column of supercooled water that flash froze a fishing trawler. They were isolated incidents, the experts said, unrelated. But I knew they were connected. I had felt the herald, the first whisper of a sigh from a door that was beginning to open. That night, the jack-o'-lanterns on our porch seemed to watch me with a new, malevolent awareness. Their grins, which I had carved with such paternal care, now looked like the rictus of things in torment. The candlelight within them flickered not with festive cheer, but with a hungry, intelligent agitation. October 29th. The world began to fray at the edges. The phone lines went down in a storm of static that sounded like a billion whispered voices. The television dissolved into snow, and in that snow, if you stared too long, you could see faint, shifting shapes, pale faces with dark, hollow eyes. The internet was a ghost town. We were alone, our little house at the end of Linden Street, with its cheerful fake cobwebs and cardboard skeletons, now feeling less like a home and more like a stage set waiting for the real play to begin. Clara S. Fear was a quiet, trembling thing. She held Josh close, his small body a bulwark against the growing dread. He was 7, caught between the excitement of the approaching holiday and the unspoken terror of his parents. He kept asking if the trick-or-treaters would still come. I didn't have an answer. It was on the 30th, the day before Halloween, that they arrived. We heard them first, a sound woven into the rising wind, not the crunch of leaves underfoot, but a dry, rustling whisper, like old paper being slowly crumpled. I peered through the slats of the blinds. The street was empty, yet not empty. The shadows between the pools of orange light from the street lamps were too deep, too solid. And then one of those shadows detached itself from the others and moved. It was tall, impossibly thin, its form seeming to be made of the very essence of the gloaming. It didn't walk so much as it drifted, a slow, deliberate glide that carried it up the walkway of the Henderson house across the street. It was followed by another, and then a third. They were organized. They moved with a chilling, tactical precision. There was no breaking down of doors. The front door of the Henderson house simply swung open, as if in invitation, and the shadows flowed inside. The screams that followed were short, sharp. And then there was only a silence that was infinitely worse. They were not zombies. That word implies a shambling, mindless hunger. These were something else. They were the dead, yes, but they were ancient, and they were cruel. They were the harvest of all the forgotten graves, the unmourned deaths, the sorrows and hatreds that had festered in the earth for centuries. And they were led by a cold, sharp intelligence. We watched from our window, frozen, as our neighborhood was systematically processed. The festive decorations took on a ghastly new life. A plastic skeleton hanging from the Larson-S oak tree seemed to twist its head and wave a bony finger. The synthetic cobwebs on Mrs. Gable's porch thickened, becoming real, trapping a shrieking figure that flailed for a moment before being enveloped by the advancing shadows. We fled that night, a desperate, hushed exodus through backyards and alleys, the cold air sharp in our lungs. The sky was a vast, black canvas, the harvest moon a diseased orange eye watching our flight. We could hear them all around us, the whispers, the dry rustling, and beneath it, a new sound, the faint, melodic ringing of bells. It was a sound from a childhood nightmare, the kind of innocent noise made terrible by context. We later learned it was the sound of their leaders, the ones who had been in the ground the longest, their garments adorned with tiny, tarnished silver bells that chimed with their movement. We found others. A handful of survivors holed up in the old stone library downtown. There was Ben, a paramedic with hollow eyes who had seen too much Maria, a librarian whose knowledge of local history became our only shaky map of this new terror, and a few others, their names blurring into the collective face of our fear. We were a pathetic army, armed with kitchen knives and a desperate, fading hope. We barricaded the heavy doors, piled books against the windows, and listened to the new world outside. The whispers grew louder, more numerous. The chill became a constant companion, seeping through the stone walls. We could feel them out there, moving through the Halloween-decorated streets, a parody of the trick-or-treaters who would never come. They were gathering. They were waiting for something. Maria, her voice a thin, reedy thing in the dark, told us what she knew. She spoke of the old legends, not of zombies, but of the Sluag, the host of the unforgiven dead. She said Halloween was never just a night for candy and costumes. It was a crack in the world, a night when the ancient dead could walk again, not as ghosts, but as a physical army. They were drawn to the warmth of the living, not to consume it, but to extinguish it, to pull the world back into the cold, silent grave from which they had risen. Their organization, their cruelty, came from a collective, spectral malice, a hatred for the light and breath they had lost. And their leader, the one the legends called the Harvest King, was the most ancient and bitter of them all. He was the reason for the season, the lord of the autumn death, and he was here to claim his throne. That was when I knew I couldn't stay. Josh was not with us. In the panic of our flight from the house, in the terrible confusion when Mr. Evans from next door had stumbled into us, his face a mask of terror, screaming about his wife, we had been separated. Clara had been holding his hand. I had been leading the way, and in a single, heart-stopping moment, he was gone, swallowed by the shadows and the rustling leaves. Clara had wanted to go back, but the tide of darkness was flowing too strong. We had to run. The look in her eyes when we reached the library's relative safety was a wound that would never heal. She sat in a corner, rocking back and forth, her arms wrapped around the emptiness where our son should have been. He was out there, my boy, on Halloween night. I told them my plan as the clock on the library wall, powered by some forgotten battery, ticked over to midnight. It was October 31st. The air in the library was so cold our breath plumed before our faces. The whispers from outside were now a constant, sibilant chorus, punctuated by the occasional, distant chime of a bell. "I am going to get him," I said, my voice sounding strange and thin in the vast, dark space. "He is at the school. The fall festival." His school always held its Halloween party in the gym on the afternoon of the 31st. Clara had taken him there before the world fell apart. He would have stayed, thinking we were coming to get him. He would be hiding, terrified, waiting for me. He was a smart boy. He would have found a good spot. The custodian-esque closet, the drama room storage, somewhere small and dark. They tried to stop me. Ben, the paramedic, put a hand on my shoulder. "Arthur, it is suicide. They ray everywhere. It is their night." I looked at Clara, who had finally stopped rocking. She looked at me, and in her gaze, I saw the same terrible, resolute knowledge that was burning in my own chest. Our world was already over. The only thing left was our son. "I have to," I said. In the end, Ben came with me. So did Maria. She said the old maps in the library's basement showed the storm drain system. It was a way to move, mostly underground. A chance. We armed ourselves with fire axes from the emergency cases. They felt like toys against the ancient, whispering death outside. The journey was a descent into a new kind of hell, a Halloween tableau made real and lethal. We moved through the storm drains, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the damp, concrete tunnels, a counterpoint to the rustling whisper that filtered down from the grates above. When we were forced to the surface, we witnessed the full, terrible glory of their night. The streets were filled with them. They moved in silent, flowing regiments. The dead walked alongside the plastic skeletons on lawns, and it was often hard to tell which was the decoration and which was the hunter. Jack-o'-lanterns lined the streets, their candlelight now a cold, phosphorescent green, illuminating the pale, drawn faces of the Sluagh. They were not decomposing. They were desiccated like ancient paper and bone, their eyes empty sockets that held a faint, cold light. They wore the tattered remnants of clothing from every era colonial waistcoats, Victorian dresses, modern jeans and t-shirts, all rendered uniformly gray and timeless by the grave. We saw what they did. They didn't just kill. They performed tableaus. A family was arranged around their own dining table, their heads replaced with expertly carved pumpkins whose faces were frozen in silent screams. A group of teenagers in party costumes were hung from a tree like macabre, rotting fruit. The air was thick with the smell of spoiled pumpkin, damp earth, and a cloying, coppery sweetness. The festive had become funereal. The harvest was one of souls. We fought when we had to. The fire axe felt useless in my hands, a tool for splitting wood, not for fighting legends. But when one of them, a thing in a tattered Union soldier-esque coat, glided from an alley, its whisper of physical force of cold, I swung. The axe bit into its chest with a sound like splitting dry kindling. It didn't scream. It simply looked down at the wound, then back at me, its hollow eyes seeming almost amused. Then it dissolved, collapsing into a pile of dust and leaves, and a single, tarnished button that clattered on the pavement. They could be destroyed, but it took everything you had, and for every one that fell, 10 more seemed to take its place. Reached the school as the moon, that great orange jack-o'-lantern in the sky, reached its zenith. The playground was a vision from a nightmare. The swings moved on their own, creaking back and forth. The slide was coated in a black, viscous fluid, and standing in the center of the basketball court was a figure taller than the others. It wore a crown of twisted, barren branches from which small, dark gourds hung. Its robes were the color of a November sky, and from its sleeves trailed long, skeletal fingers. Around its neck hung a cluster of silver bells that did not chime, but rather let out a low, dissonant hum that vibrated in my teeth. The Harvest King. It stood, surveying its domain, its back to us, and it was standing guard at the doors to the gymnasium. Ben and Maria created a distraction, rushing out from our hiding place behind the dumpsters, shouting, waving their axes. The king turned its head slowly, the movement like stone grinding on stone. A contingent of the Sluag peeled away from the main host and flowed toward them. It was my chance. While the King-S attention was divided, I sprinted for the gym-S side door, the one the janitors used. The inside of the school was a tomb. Lockers stood open, their contents spilled onto the floor like metallic guts. Paper ghosts and bats, cut by childish hands, fluttered in a cold, unfelt breeze. I followed the familiar path to the gym, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pushed the heavy double doors open. The gym was vast and dark, the only light coming from the emergency exit signs, casting everything in a bloody glow. The remnants of the fall festival were everywhere: overturned tables, a spilled punch bowl that looked like a pool of blood in the dim light, scattered candy wrappers that crunched under my feet like insects. And in the center of the basketball court, surrounded by silent, watching Sluag, was a small, huddled figure wearing a store-bought astronaut costume. "Josh," I whispered, the word tearing from my throat. He turned. His helmet was off, and his face was pale and streaked with tears. "Dad." I ran. Didn't he care about the 24 dead things that turned their hollow gazes upon me? I had my fire axe. I had my desperation. I would cut a path through hell itself to reach him. I swung the axe in wide, reckless arcs, feeling the dry, brittle crunch as it connected, feeling the cold dust spray against my face. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if they had all the time in the world, which they did. They were eternity, and I was a single, frantic heartbeat. I reached him. I swept him into my arms, his small body trembling against mine. He felt so light, so fragile. "Ivy got you, buddy. Ivy got you." I turned to flee, to find a way out, any way out, and I found my path blocked. The Harvest King stood in the doorway I had entered, its form filling the frame. The humming from its bells was a physical pressure in the air, making my ears pop. It glided forward, the shadows in the room deepening and stretching toward it, as if drawn to its presence. It stopped a few feet from us. It didn't look at me. Its hollow gaze was fixed on Josh. It raised one of its long, skeletal hands. In its palm rested a single piece of candy, a wrapped caramel apple pop, the kind Josh loved. It was an offering, a poisoned gift, a trick, with the treat being our souls. "No," I said, my voice a ragged thing. I tightened my grip on the axe. The king's head tilted. It made a sound then, not a whisper, but a dry, rustling laugh that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It took another step, the bells humming louder. The cold radiating from it was absolute, the same concentrated chill I had felt in my kitchen 3 days ago, the herald of the end of the world. Josh buried his face in my neck. "Dad, I am scared." I was about to swing to make my last, futile stand, when Josh did something I will never forget. He lifted his head from my shoulder and looked directly at the Harvest King. And he spoke, his small voice clear and steady in the humming silence. "You are not supposed to be here," he said. "The mask comes off after midnight." The king froze. The entire gym seemed to hold its breath. The humming from the bells stuttered, then ceased. The advancing sluag stopped their slow, relentless glide. The king's form seemed to waver, like a reflection on disturbed water. It was a child's logic, spoken with the absolute authority of innocence on a night when rules were everything. It was a spell. The Harvest King looked down at the piece of candy in its hand. It slowly closed its skeletal fingers around it. When it opened its hand again, the candy was gone, replaced by a handful of black, fertile soil. It then brought its hand to its face, the face that was not a face, but a shadow, and it pulled. There was a sound like tearing silk, like 1,000 roots being ripped from the earth. The form of the king shuddered and collapsed inward, its robes deflating, its crown of branches clattering to the gym floor. The substance of it, the cold, the malice, the ancient intelligence, didn't he vanish? It flowed, a rushing torrent of shadow and whispers, past us and out through the gym doors. A silent, screaming exodus. The sluag in the gym dissolved. One moment they were there, the next they were piles of dust and memory. The oppressive cold began to lift, replaced by the simple, natural chill of an unheated building in late October. I stood there holding my son, trembling from a release of tension so profound I thought my bones would break. We had won. We had broken the spell. We had survived Halloween. We found Ben and Maria outside, shaken but alive. The streets were empty. The green, phosphorescent light in the jack-o'-lanterns had faded, leaving them as ordinary, rotting vegetables. The whispers were gone. The only sound was the wind, a natural, clean wind, moving through the bare branches of the trees. The world was quiet. The long night was over. We made our way back to the library as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky. November 1st. All Saints' Day. The Day of the Dead was past. Clara was waiting at the door, and the sound of her cry when she saw us, The feel of her arms around both of us was a warmth I thought I would never feel again. We thought it was over. We truly did. We were survivors. We had faced the ancient dark, and through a child's words, we had turned it back. We began the long, slow work of picking up the pieces, of burying the real dead, of trying to find a new normal in a world that had been fundamentally scarred. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind blows just right from the north, I feel it. A faint, concentrated spot of cold. Not the chill of winter, but that same dry, physical ice. And if I listen very, very closely on the very edge of hearing, I can hear it. Not a whisper, not anymore. It has something else. It has a low, rhythmic ticking, like a clock counting down in a deep, deep well. It has not coming from outside. It has inside the walls, or under the floor. Sometimes I think it has inside my own head. A metronome keeping time for a song I can no longer hear. I never told Clara. She has enough of her own ghosts. She sleeps with the light on now, a small battery-powered lantern that casts long, dancing shadows I know she hates. Josh seems fine on the surface. He plays, he laughs. He goes to the new school they set up in the community center. But sometimes I catch him just staring out the window at the barren November trees, his expression far too old for his years. He never talks about that night. When I tried to ask him once about what he said to the Harvest King, he just looked at me with a blankness that made my blood run cold and said, "I don't remember, Dad." The official story is one of mass hysteria, a gas leak, some kind of shared psychotic event. It is easier for people to believe that than the truth. Ben and Maria are the only ones who know, the only ones I can talk to. We meet sometimes in what is left of the old library, and we don't speak much. We just sit and listen to the silence and wait. I was in the basement today, looking for the Christmas decorations. Clara thought it would be good for us to try and bring some normalcy back. I found the box tucked away behind the water heater, and next to it, half hidden in the dust, was a single, small object. A little plastic astronaut helmet. It must have fallen off during our flight. I picked it up. It was cold. Not the chill of the concrete floor, but that same deep, penetrating cold. And as I held it, the ticking I usually only heard at night became suddenly, deafeningly loud. It was coming from inside the helmet. I dropped it. It clattered on the floor, the sound echoing in the silent basement. The ticking stopped. I left the box of decorations. I left the helmet lying there. I walked back up the stairs, my legs weak. I am sitting at the kitchen table now, writing this down. I don't know why. Maybe because someone needs to know that it is not over. The Harvest King is gone, yes. The spell was broken. But a spell is just a pattern. And nature loves patterns. Halloween is a crack in the world, Maria said. Cracks can be sealed, but they never truly disappear. They are weak points, waiting. The cold spot is right behind me now. I can feel it, a small, focused circle of winter against my back. The ticking has started again, soft but insistent. It is not in the walls. It is in this room. It is counting down. counting down the days. It has a long, slow count. It has 364 days to go. I looked at the calendar on the wall, the one with the cheerful, grinning turkey. November 2nd. The ticking was a soft, metallic pulse in the quiet kitchen. 364 days. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A reminder that the world had been fundamentally altered, that the rules had been rewritten, and we had only won a stay of execution. I pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the tile. The sound was obscenely loud. I had to get out of the kitchen, away from that focused cold. I walked to the living room where Clara was watching some inane morning show, the volume low. She looked up and gave me a fragile smile. "Find the decorations." "Not all of them," I said, my voice sounding rough. "I'll look again later." I went upstairs and stood outside Josh's door. It was closed. I pressed my ear against the cool wood, listening. I heard the rustle of pages. He was awake, reading. I almost knocked. I almost asked him again, begged him to tell me what he remembered, to explain how he knew what to say. But I remembered the blankness in his eyes, a void where that memory should have been. I lowered my hand and walked away. The day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I called Ben. "We need to talk," I said. He came over that evening after Clara had gone to bed. We sat in the garage. The door closed. The smell of gasoline and old lawnmower oil a strange comfort. I told him about the helmet, the cold, the ticking, the count. Ben listened, his face grim. He didn't try to offer a rational explanation. He just nodded slowly. "Maria's been hearing it too," he said, "in her apartment. She says it's in the pipes." "It's not in the pipes," I said. "It's counting." "What do we do?" he asked, his voice hollow. I had no answer. We were soldiers who had fought a war everyone else thought was a dream. And we were the only ones who knew the enemy was just regrouping, biding its time. We couldn't prepare. We couldn't warn anyone. We could only wait. That night, I lay in bed next to Clara, listening to her breathe. The ticking was a soft, rhythmic presence in the dark, a sound only for me. I focused on it, trying to discern a pattern, a source. It was everywhere and nowhere, a temporal infection in the very fabric of our home. I thought about the Harvest King, its form dissolving at a child's command. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been dismissed. Its power, its very existence, was tied to the rules of the night. Josh hadn't killed it with a weapon. He had corrected its timing. The mask comes off after midnight. But what if the king had learned? What if it wasn't just about a single night anymore? The cold spot, the ticking, they were a residue, an echo, a foothold. Weeks turned into a bleak, gray November. The world tried to heal. News reports shifted from the event to the recovery efforts. The official narrative solidified, a comfortable blanket of lies smothering the terrifying truth. We were the lucky ones, the survivors. We were supposed to be grateful. I started taking long walks, trying to clear my head of the ticking. One afternoon, I found myself at the edge of the woods behind the old school. The playground was empty, the swing still. I stared at the basketball court where the king had stood. The pavement was cracked, and from the largest fissure, a patch of dark, ugly mushrooms had sprouted in a perfect circle. They were black and withered, like tiny, petrified hands clawing their way out of the earth. As I watched, a faint, shimmering cold rose from them, visible in the crisp air, and the ticking, which had been a background noise in my skull, synchronized perfectly with a slow black droplet of sap that fell from one of the mushrooms onto the pavement. Tick, drip, tick, drip. It was growing. It was putting down roots. I ran home, my heart thudding. I went straight to the basement. The little astronaut helmet was still there, lying on the floor where I dropped it. But it wasn't alone. A fine gray dust had settled around it, a dust I knew too well. And from the helmet's visor, a single, thin, thorny vine had emerged, its tip curled like a question mark. It was probing the air, searching. I backed away, up the stairs, and closed the basement door. I leaned against it, my breath coming in short gasps. The ticking was louder now, no longer a secret in my mind, but a physical vibration in the door at my back. It wasn't waiting for Halloween. It was learning how to live here. It was practicing. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. The words wouldn't form. How could I explain the vine, the dust, the practiced, deliberate growth? Instead, I went to the garage and found a roll of duct tape. I went back inside, and with Clara watching from the kitchen with a confused and worried expression, I taped the basement door shut. I ran a thick, cross-hatched pattern of silver tape over the seam where the door met the frame. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice thin. "Mice," I said, the lye ash in my mouth. "I think there's a nest down there. I don't want them getting into the house." She accepted this. It was easier than the truth. I saw the relief in her eyes, the desire for a simple, solvable problem. But as I pressed the final strip of tape into place, I felt the cold seeping through the wood, and the ticking transmitted itself up through the frame and into my fingertips. The tape was a gesture, nothing more. A prayer. That night I dreamed of roots. Not the thick, gnarled roots of trees, but thin, fibrous, pale things pushing through the foundation of our house, threading their way through the insulation, questing behind the drywall. I woke with a start, the taste of soil in my mouth. The room was freezing. Clara was shivering in her sleep, huddled under the blankets. The cold spot had moved. It was no longer a point behind me. It had expanded, a chill that emanated from the floor itself. I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the floorboards. The ticking was there, but it was different now. It had been joined by another sound, a faint, dry, scraping noise, like a branch brushing against a window pane. But there were no trees close to the house on this side. The next morning, I called a contractor. I said we had a dampness problem in the basement, a persistent cold. He was a burly, pragmatic man named Dave. He came over, and I watched as he cut away my pathetic duct tape seal with a utility knife. He gave me a look that was part pity, part amusement. before heading down the stairs. I waited at the top, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The scraping from below stopped. After a long 10 minutes, Dave came back up, dusting off his hands. "Can't find a thing," he said. "Bone dry. No leaks, no cracks in the foundation big enough to matter. Insulation's fine. It's just a cold basement, pal. They all are this time of year." I wanted to scream. I wanted to drag him down there and show him the helmet, the vine, the circle of mushrooms on his own damn thermal camera. But I just nodded, paid him in cash, and showed him out. As his truck pulled away, I stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring into the gloom. The air that wafted up was still and warm. The normal, slightly musty air of any basement. The cold was gone. The ticking was silent. The vine, when I forced myself to go down and look, had retreated back into the helmet, leaving only a tiny, puckered hole in the plastic. It was hiding. It knew. It was learning about us, too. I went to the library. Not the new, temporary one, but the shell of the old one, where Ben, Maria, and I sometimes met. It was empty, most of its collection lost or water damaged. The silence here was different. It was a hollow, waiting silence. Ben and Maria were already there, sitting on a pair of dusty chairs they'd pulled into a corner. "It's getting smarter," I said, and I told them everything. The helmet, the vine, the contractor, the way it hid itself. Maria wrapped her arms around herself. "It's not just a seasonal haunting anymore. It's an infestation." Ben nodded, his face pale. The rules changed when Josh spoke. It was a draw, not a victory. We forced a stalemate, and now it's adapting, finding new ways in. "The crack in the world," I whispered. "We didn't seal it. We just showed it that it couldn't come through the front door. So now it's looking for a back window." We sat in the dusty silence of the ruined library, 3 people guarding a truth that was slowly becoming a prison. The world outside thought it was over. They were planning for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, for New Year. But we knew the truth. The countdown wasn't to a single night of terror. It was to the moment this new, patient, intelligent presence finished its work. It was learning how to make our world its own, and when the clock hit 0, it wouldn't need a holiday to cross over. It would already be here. We left the library as a light snow began to fall, the first of the year. It should have been beautiful, a clean blanket over the scars of the town. But each flake felt like a tiny, cold tick of the clock. I drove home, the silence in the car, a physical weight. When I walked in, Clara was in the living room, holding a small, rectangular box. "This was on the porch," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. "It doesn't have a label. It was a plain white box, the kind you might get from a bakery. I took it from her. It was warm. Not the warmth of the sun, but a deep, feverish heat. I set it on the coffee table, and we both stared at it. "Should we open it?" she asked. Before I could answer, Josh came into the room. He saw the box and stopped. His eyes, which had been so distant, focused on it with with an intensity I hadn't seen since that night. He walked forward, not with curiosity, but with a strange sense of purpose. He didn't ask what it was. He simply reached out and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like freshly turned earth, was a small porcelain figure. It was a boy in a plastic astronaut helmet. The detail was perfect, from the scuff on his knee to the particular way his hair stuck out from under the helmet. It was Josh. Clara gasped and put a hand to her mouth. I felt the world tilt. This was not a threat. It was a gift, a recognition. Josh picked the figure up. He held it in his palm, staring into its painted, vacant eyes. The heat from the box seemed to transfer into the figurine, making his hand glow pink. "Josh," I said, my voice a strained whisper. "Put it down." He didn't look at me. He closed his fingers around the porcelain boy. "He's warm," Josh said. Then he looked at me, and for the first time in weeks, there was a flicker of memory in his gaze. Not of fear, but of something else. Understanding. "He likes the warmth, Dad. He's just cold." He turned and walked out of the room, clutching the figurine tightly in his hand. Clara started to cry, soft, helpless sobs. I could only watch him go, my son, the savior, now holding a piece of the thing he had turned away. The line between us and it was blurring. The invasion was no longer in the basement or the walls. It was in his hand. It was in his head. And it was learning what it meant to be loved. I followed him upstairs, my feet heavy on the treads. Clara's crying faded behind me, muffled by the walls. Josh's door was closed. I stood before it, my hand raised to knock, but I couldn't make my fist connect with the wood. What would I say? What could I do? Take it from him, smash it. I remembered the blank void in his eyes when I asked him about the Harvest King. That void was now filled with this understanding. To take it away might be to break something inside him forever. I heard him talking. A low, murmuring monologue, the way he used to talk to his action figures. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. And it's always dark there, he was saying, his voice conversational. But not a bad dark. A quiet dark. He says the soil is soft. He says the roots are like strings on a guitar. He wants to learn the song. A cold dread, deeper than any I had felt from the cold spot, washed over me. It wasn't just observing him. It was communicating. I backed away from the door and went to our bedroom. Clara was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. "What was that, Mark?" she asked without looking up. "What is happening?" I had no lies left that would fit. The mouse excuse was pathetic. The gas leak story was a distant, hollow joke. I sat beside her, the mattress dipping under my weight. "I don't know," I said, and it was the truest thing I said in weeks. But it's not over. She lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed and terrified. Is it because of what Josh did?" "I think it's because of what he is," I whispered. "To them, he is not just a boy. He S the one who spoke the rule. He S the key. We spent the rest of the day in a state of suspended animation. Josh stayed in his room. The house was preternaturally quiet. The usual hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, all seemed to have been swallowed by a greater silence. The cold spot was gone. The ticking had stopped. The peace was more frightening than the presence had been. When Josh came down for dinner, he was empty-handed. He ate his macaroni and cheese quietly, his gaze distant again, but a different kind of distant. Before, it had been a retreat. Now, it seemed like he was listening. Clara and I exchanged glances over his head, a silent conversation of shared, helpless fear. After he went back upstairs, I crept into his room. The figurine was on his nightstand, standing upright. In the dim light from the hallway, it seemed to be looking straight at me. The porcelain face was no longer a perfect, vacant replica. The mouth, just a painted line before, now seemed to be curved into the faintest, most subtle of smiles. I fled the room. That night, I dreamed of the library again. Not the ruined one, but the old one, whole and filled with books. Ben and Mario were there, but they were made of porcelain, their faces fixed in polite, smiling masks. Josh was there too, reading from a large, leather-bound book. The words he spoke were in English. They were the dry, scraping sound of roots moving through stone. I tried to run to him, but my feet were tangled in pale, fibrous vines that had grown up through the floorboards. I looked down and saw that the vines were sprouting from my own ankles, digging into the wood, anchoring me in place. I woke with a gasp, my skin slick with sweat. The room was warm. Clara was asleep. But from Josh's room, through the wall, I heard it, not ticking, not scraping. It was a low, soft, humming sound. A single, sustained note, like a cello playing in a room far away. It was a sound I had never heard before, but I knew it with a primal certainty. It was the sound of growth. It was the sound of something putting down roots, not in the soil, but in the silence of our house, in the warmth of my son's hand. It was learning our song. The humming stopped just before dawn. The sudden silence was a shock, jolting me from a half-doze I hadn't realized I'd fallen into. I lay there, straining my ears, waiting for it to return. But the house was still. Not just quiet, but profoundly still, as if it were holding its breath. When Josh came down for breakfast, he was different. The listening quality was gone, replaced by a placid, almost serene normalcy. He chattered about a project at school, his words ordinary and light. He ate his cereal with a steady hand. Clara watched him, a fragile hope blooming in her eyes. She wanted so badly to believe the crisis had passed. I saw her glance at me, a silent plea to agree with this new, peaceful narrative. I couldn't. The normalcy was a performance. It was too perfect. The thing in the box had given him a focus, a channel, and now it didn't need to hum or tick. It had achieved a connection. I called Ben from my office. It sent him a gift, I said, keeping my voice low. A figurine of himself. There There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Maria found something this morning," he finally said, his voice grim. "On her balcony. A flower pot she hasn't used in years. Something's growing in it. What is it? I don't know. It's black, shiny, like polished stone. It wasn't there last night." We were silent for a moment, the horror settling between us like a third presence on the call. It wasn't just in our house. It was seeding itself everywhere, in small, insignificant places. Testing the soil. "I have to get it away from him, Ben," I whispered. "That figurine." "How?" he asked. "You said it yourself. It's communicating with him. Taking it might be like cutting a cord. We don't know what that would do." I ended the call and went through the motions of the day. I drove to work, attended meetings, typed emails. All the while, my mind was in Josh's room, fixed on that small, smiling porcelain face. It was an anchor, a beacon. It was making a home inside my son. That evening, I found Josh in the backyard, kicking a soccer ball against the fence. The figurine was not with him. This was my chance. I went upstairs, my heart thudding a guilty rhythm. His door was open. The room was neat. And on the nightstand, the porcelain Josh stood, watching the empty room. I picked it up. It was still warm, a living, unsettling heat that pulsed faintly against my palm. The painted eyes seemed to follow me. I had a sudden, violent urge to hurl it against the wall, to shatter it into 1,000 pieces. My fingers tightened around it. A wave of dizziness hit me. The room swam, the colors bleeding together. For a split second, I wasn't in my son's bedroom. I was standing in a vast, dark plain under a sky of churning, silent clouds. The air was thick and cold, and the ground beneath my feet was not soil, but a tangled, fibrous mass of roots that pulsed with a slow, deep rhythm. In the distance, I saw a single, towering shape, a leafless, petrified tree, and from its branches hung hundreds of small, warm lights. They were the stolen moments, the forgotten fears, the warmth of a child's breath. They were the fuel. Then the vision was gone. I was back in the room, clutching the figurine, my knuckles white. It had shown me. It had let me see its home, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. This is what I am. This is what I need. I didn't smash it. I set it back down, my hand trembling. I had learned something vital, something more terrifying than any cold spot or ticking clock. It wasn't malicious. It was hungry. It was a fundamental emptiness, a cosmic need, and it had found a way to be fed. And my son, the rule speaker, was its chosen conduit. I went back downstairs and out into the yard. Josh had stopped kicking the ball. He was just standing there, looking at the back of the house, at his window. "He showed you, didn't he?" he said, without turning to look at me. My blood ran cold. "What?" "The quiet dark," Josh said, his voice calm and far too old. "He's lonely, Dad. And he's so cold." He finally turned to face me, and his eyes were full of a pity that no child should ever possess. "He just doesn't want to be alone anymore." I looked at my son, standing in the fading light, and I knew then that we had already lost. The countdown wasn't to an invasion. It was to a merger. The 0 hour was the moment our world became indistinguishable from his, the moment the cold, dark plane outside of time found a permanent home in our warmth. And my son was holding the door open. I took a step toward him, my hand outstretched, a useless gesture. I wanted to grab him, to shake him, to scream that it was a lie, that it was a predator using the language of a lost child to get what it wanted. But the words died in my throat. The vision of that desolate plain was seared into my mind. The sheer, simple truth of its emptiness, more convincing than any monster's roar. "Josh," I managed, my voice cracking. You can let him in like that." "He's already in," Josh said, his gaze unwavering. "He's in the quiet places, in the spaces between the ticks of the clock." He showed me how to listen. He looked down at his own hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. He says I am like a warm stove in a cold house. The metaphor was too sophisticated for him. It was borrowing his voice, his face, but the words were not entirely his. The thing was learning to speak through him, not just to him. Clara called us in for dinner. The sound of her voice, so normal, so anchored in our world of macaroni and bedtime stories, was a lifeline. Josh's expression shifted, the ancient pity melting away into the mild interest of a hungry boy. He ran inside, leaving me alone in the twilight. I stood there for a long time, watching the shadows deepen in the yard. Every dark patch under a bush, every space between the fence slats, seemed alive with potential. It was in the quiet places. It was learning our song. The words echoed in my head, a terrifying mantra. That night, I didn't dream of roots or libraries. I dreamed I was a single, warm light hanging from a branch on that petrified tree. Below me, the vast, fibrous plain stretched into infinity, and I was not afraid. I was content. I was part of something vast and silent and eternal. The warmth was slowly leaching out of me, a comfortable, gentle drain, and I didn't mind. I was keeping the dark from being lonely. I woke not with a gasp, but with a slow, dreadful realization. The peace from the dream lingered, a seductive poison. The thing wasn't just attacking. It was offering a kind of solace, a release from the struggle. It was making its emptiness feel like peace. I got out of bed and went to the window. The street was dark and still. In the house across the way, a single light was on in an upstairs window. As I watched, a shadow passed behind the curtain, a tall, thin silhouette that paused for a moment, as if looking back at me. It was old Mrs. Henderson, a lifelong insomniac, but the shape was wrong. It was too straight, too still. Then it was gone, and the light went out. It wasn't just in our house. It wasn't just in Maria's flower pot. It was seeding itself in the quiet, lonely places all over town. In the sleepless nights of the elderly, in the forgotten corners of attics, in the silent spaces between heartbeats. It was finding its conduits, its warm stoves, turned from the window. The fight was changing. It was no longer about barricading a door or destroying a source. It was about fighting an idea, a persuasive emptiness that was offering to swallow our fears and our loneliness in exchange for our warmth, our noise, our lives. And I didn't know how to fight something that my own son and some deep, tired part of myself was starting to see as a friend. The next morning, the newspaper was on the driveway, wrapped in plastic against the damp. The headline was small and local, tucked below the fold. Unexplained vandalism at Oak Creek Cemetery. The article described how several of the oldest, most weathered headstones had been found clean, as if recently polished, their inscriptions sharp and clear. But the oddity, the thing the groundskeeper couldn't explain, was that the dirt in front of these stones was not disturbed by footprints or tools. Instead, it was covered in a fine black dust that sparkled faintly in the light, like crushed obsidian. I showed the paper to Ben when he came over, his face haggard. He pointed a trembling finger at the description of the dust. "It's the same stuff," he said. "The same stuff growing in Maria's flower pot. It's not just growing, it's shedding." Clara came into the kitchen, her eyes fixed on Josh's empty chair. "He's still asleep," she said. "He never sleeps this late." The fear in her voice was a thin, sharp wire. We went upstairs together, a silent, grim procession. His door was ajar. I pushed it open. Josh was in bed, the covers pulled to his chin. He was awake, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling. He looked peaceful. On his nightstand, the porcelain figurine stood sentinel. But it had changed. Overnight, a delicate black tracery had appeared on the white porcelain, crawling up its legs and across the tiny astronaut suit. It looked like fine, intricate cracks, but it wasn't. It was a pattern. It was the same shimmering black material from the cemetery and the flower pot. It was becoming part of the figurine, or the figurine was becoming part of it. "Josh," Clara whispered, moving to sit on the edge of his bed. He didn't look at her. "He's teaching me the new song," Josh said, his voice a soft, dreamy monotone. "It's quieter than the old one. It doesn't have any words. It's just the sound of things being still." I looked from my son's placid face to the encroaching blackness on the figurine. The thing wasn't just communicating. It was educating. It was rewiring his sense of reality, replacing the noisy chaos of life with the seductive silence of its own nature. Ben was staring out the window. "Mark," he said, his voice tight. "Look." I joined him. The light snow from yesterday had melted, leaving the lawns wet and green. But our yard and Ben's yard next door were different. Overnight, a network of that same black, shimmering dust had appeared on the grass, tracing a complex, web-like pattern that stretched from our property line to his. It wasn't random. It looked like a diagram, a circuit board, or a root system drawn in ink on the earth. It was mapping us. It was connecting the points of its presence. Our houses, Maria's balcony, the cemetery. We were the nodes, and it was drawing the lines between us. Josh sat up in bed, finally looking at us. He smiled, a gentle, distant smile. He says not to be afraid. He says when the song is finished, no one will be lonely ever again. The horror was no longer a sharp, stabbing fear. It was a deep, cold weight settling in my stomach. We weren't fighting a monster at the door. We were watching the world slowly being redrawn in its image, and the only person who might know how to stop it was the one learning to sing its praises. The battle was over before it began. We were living in the aftermath, in the quiet, spreading stain of a new world being born.